Hello guys, welcome to Percy Jackson. So in this video, we will see, what if Percy read the Naruto Conquered the Power of Vampire Lord? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. An Unwanted Legacy. The smell of baking chocolate chip cookies, tinged with an aggressive amount of blue food coloring, usually meant home. It was the scent of safety, of unconditional love wrapped in a warm, gooey package. Tonight, it was the scent of failure. It clung to the air in Sally Jackson's small apartment, thick and suffocating, a sweet, cloying monument to a loss so sharp it felt like a physical shard of glass lodged under his ribs. Percy sat at the kitchen table, a plate of the offending cookies pushed to the far side. They were a week old, stale and hard as sea-worn stones. His mother had baked them the day he'd returned from the quest, her eyes full of a hope he couldn't stomach. He'd just nodded, mumbled something about being tired, and locked himself in his room. He hadn't touched a single one. Lee Fletcher was dead, son of Apollo, head counselor, the guy who could make an arrow sing and a campfire rhyme. He'd died with a gorgon's claw in his chest, bleeding out on a dusty arizo. Roadside while Percy had been busy fighting its sister. They'd been sent on a retrieval mission by Hermes, something about a stolen lyre that had apparently been a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Trivial. A milk run, they'd been told, but the intelligence was bad. Hermes hadn't mentioned the gorgons had nested, that there were 3, not 1. An oversight. A simple, godly oversight that had cost Lee his life. When Percy had returned to Olympus to report, trailing the ashes of his friend, Hermes had clapped him on the shoulder, offered a sad, perfunctory smile, and said, "Unfortunate business, that. But you secured the lyre. Well done, lad." And in that moment, something inside Percy had fractured. The loyalty, the hard-won faith, the belief that for all their flaws, the gods were ultimately on their side, it all just crumbled into dust. He wasn't a hero. He was a tool, a sharp, effective, and utterly disposable tool. Lee had been the price of a golden instrument. Percy wondered what he would be the price for one day. He pushed back from the table, the scrape of the chair legs loud in the quiet apartment. Sleep wouldn't come. It never did anymore. When he closed his eyes, he saw Lee's surprised face. The light dimming from his eyes. He heard the gorgon's triumphant shriek. So he stayed awake. Pacing the small living room, his gaze fell on a cardboard box tucked into a corner. It was from an old friend from school, one of the few who didn't know his secret, who just thought Percy was a troubled kid with a weird habit of getting expelled. The box had been there for a month. A birthday gift he'd never bothered to open. Scrawled on the side in black marker were the words, "Thought you'd dig this. It's about a loudmouthed kid who never gives up." Sound familiar? With a sigh of pure, undiluted boredom, Percy tore the box open. It was filled with books. Not novels, but manga. The art was dynamic, all sharp lines and expressive eyes. The title on the spine read Naruto. He pulled out the first volume and slumped onto the couch. The story was simple enough. An outcast kid, a pariah in his own village, possessed by a demon fox he didn't ask for. He was loud, obnoxious, and utterly determined to earn the respect of the people who scorned him. He wanted to become their leader, their Hokage, not through birthright or destiny, but through sheer, unbreakable will. Percy kept reading. He read through the night, the stack of finished volumes growing on the floor beside him. He saw the kid, Naruto, learn to control the monstrous power inside him, to turn a curse into a gift. He saw him master techniques, outsmart enemies who were stronger and faster, and forge bonds with his comrades that were stronger than steel. He saw a world where power wasn't just inherited, it was honed. It was earned through bleeding knuckles and relentless training. A world where strategy and deception were just as important as raw strength. There was a clarity to it, a sense of agency that Percy had never truly felt. Demigods were born with their powers. They were blessings from their divine parents, tools to be used in service to Olympus. But these shinobi, they molded their energy, their chakra. They studied, they trained, they pushed their bodies and minds to the absolute limit. They chose their own path. They fought for their own reasons, for their village, for their friends. A low, Guttural roar from the street outside ripped him from the pages. It wasn't the sound of a car backfiring or a city bus groaning to a halt. It was a sound he knew in his bones. The sound of the ancient world tearing its way into the new. He felt a familiar thrum of dread, but it was muted, buried under a thick layer of apathy. Let someone else handle it, a bitter voice in his head whispered. Let one of Apollo's other kids, or maybe a child of Ares, earn their father's fleeting approval. But then came a scream. A human scream. High-pitched, terrified, and abruptly cut short. Percy's jaw tightened. He was tired. He was angry. He was done. But he wasn't a monster. He left the book open on the couch, the image of a young ninja with defiant eyes staring up at the ceiling. Riptide was in his pocket. A familiar weight. He didn't bother with armor. He just pulled on a dark hoodie and slipped out the fire escape, melting into the rain-slicked New York night. The chaos was a few blocks east, centered on a narrow, forgotten alleyway sandwiched between a laundromat and a derelict theater. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the ozone tang of raw magic. 2 streetlights had been shattered, casting the scene in a jagged mosaic of light and deep shadow. Debris littered the ground, splintered wood from smashed crates, shattered glass, and the mangled remains of a dumpster that looked like it had been peeled open like a tin can. At the center of the destruction, 2 figures were locked in a deadly, silent dance. One was a monster, but not like any Percy had ever seen. It was vaguely humanoid, tall and skeletal, but its skin was a cracked, obsidian black that seemed to drink the light around it. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless head, and its limbs were too long, ending in claws that dripped a viscous, steaming ichor. The most disturbing thing about it was the aura it projected, a palpable wave of heat that felt like standing too close to a blast furnace, a dry, scorching presence that made the very air seem to wither. Its opponent was a man, or at least he looked like one. He was tall and impossibly graceful, moving with a liquid speed that made Percy's demigod reflexes feel sluggish. He wore archaic, form-fitting armor of a dull, silver-gray metal that seemed to be fused with hardened black leather. It was ornate but functional, bearing no resemblance to the Greek or Roman styles Percy was used to. A high collar framed a pale, aristocratic face, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain and sweat. His eyes glowed with a soft, crimson light, and he fought with a silent, focused fury. He wielded no weapon, his hands lashing out in blurs, his fingers tipped with what looked like claws of hardened shadow. The scorched creature was a brute, all power and heat. The armored man was a blade, all speed and precision. Percy watched, hidden in the shadows of a fire escape, as the man weaved around a clumsy, powerful swing, his hand darting out to strike the creature's chest. The impact made no sound, but the creature recoiled, a patch of its obsidian skin dissolving into black dust. But the man was flagging. A deep, ragged gash ran across his side, and his movements, while still incredibly fast, were losing their razor-sharp edge. The creature seemed to sense it. It let out another of those guttural roars and lunged, its claws extended. The armored man sidestepped, but not fast enough. A claw caught him in the shoulder, tearing through the strange metal and drawing a spray of dark blood. He staggered back, and in that moment of weakness, the creature brought its hands together. The scorching aura around it intensified, and a spear of what looked like solidified, blinding sunlight materialized between its palms. It was a horrifying paradox, a weapon of pure light wielded by a creature of utter darkness. The man's crimson eyes widened. He tried to raise a hand, to form a shield of shadow. But he was too slow, too wounded. The creature lunged and drove the spear of light straight through his abdomen, pinning him to the brick wall behind him. The man didn't scream. He let out a choked gasp, his body convulsing. The light from the spear was actively burning him from the inside out, sizzling like water on a hot skillet. His crimson eyes began to dim. Percy didn't think. He acted. That was always his problem. He uncapped Riptide, the familiar bronze blade springing to life in his hand. He wasn't thinking about the gods, or Lee, or his own broken spirit. He was just thinking that nothing deserved to die like that. He vaulted over the railing of the fire escape, landing in a crouch on the wet pavement. "Hey, ugly," he yelled. The faceless creature turned its head towards him. The heat radiating from it intensified. Percy could feel the moisture being wicked from his skin. This thing was not from the underworld. It felt older, stranger. But it was distracted. That was all the opening Percy needed. There was a fire hydrant on the corner of the alley, its cap loosened by the earlier destruction. Percy reached out with his senses, feeling the familiar pull of the water pressure deep within the city's iron veins. He yanked, and the cap blew off with a cannon-like boom. A massive gout of water erupted into the alley. Percy shaped it with his will, forming a battering ram of churning, high-pressure water and slamming it into the creature. The impact was immense. The creature was lifted off its feet and hurled down the alley, steam hissing violently as the water met its scorching aura. It lost its grip on the light spear, which thankfully dissolved back into nothingness. The creature scrambled to its feet, shaking its head. It fixed its featureless gaze on Percy, letting out a low, menacing growl. For a moment, Percy thought it would charge. But then, it paused. It tilted its head as if listening to a voice only it could hear. Then, with a final, hateful glance at the impaled man against the wall, it seemed to fold into itself, collapsing into a pinpoint of shadow before vanishing completely. Its mission, whatever it had been, was apparently complete. The alley fell silent, save for the hiss of the gushing fire hydrant and the soft patter of the rain. Percy capped Riptide and rushed to the wounded man, who was now slumping down the wall. The hole in his gut smoking with golden embers. He was dying, and dying fast. "Hey, hang on," Percy said, kneeling beside him. I don't know what you are, but I can try to help." He thought of the ambrosia and nectar in his pocket, but he had a feeling it would be like poison to this being. The man looked up, his crimson eyes locking onto Percy's. There was no pain in them, only a vast, ancient weariness. A voice echoed in Percy's mind, not through his ears, but directly in his consciousness. It was a voice that felt like crumbling stone and dried blood, a voice that had commanded armies and whispered secrets in the ears of long-dead kings. Less than you have a warrior's heart, son of the sea. But it is broken. I feel the schism in your soul. The anger. The betrayal. It is a fertile ground for power. Greater than. Percy flinched. Who? What are you? Less than my name is Valerius. And I am the last of my line. That creature was a sun-scorched. A hunter of abominations. A soldier in a forgotten war that is beginning anew. They have found this world. Greater than. The hole in his stomach was getting wider, his form starting to flake away at the edges like old parchment. Less than I am spent. My time is over. But my legacy, my power, it cannot be allowed to fade. The bloodline must not end. It requires a vessel, one of strength, of will, and of tragedy. A soul that understands loss is a soul that can comprehend the weight of eternity. Greater than. Before Percy could react, Valerius's hand shot out and gripped his forearm. It was like being seized by a vice made of ice and iron. An unholy energy, cold and sharp, flooded into him. It wasn't like the warmth of his demigod powers. This was a chilling, invasive force. No, stop, Percy yelled, trying to pull away, but the grip was unbreakable. Less than it is not a gift, boy. It is a burden, a crown of shadows and a throne of blood. But it is also freedom. Freedom from the petty whims of your so-called gods. Freedom to carve your own destiny. Greater than. Percy's vision tunneled. He felt a torrent of information, of memories that were not his own, crashing into his mind. Millennia of existence, of battles fought in darkness, of strategies honed over centuries, of a deep, profound understanding of the life force that flowed through all things. Blood, they called it, but it was so much more. He felt the echo of Valerius's first kill, the taste of his first feeding. The loneliness of his immortality. It was too much. His mind was splintering under the weight of an eternal lifetime. And then came the power. It was a dormant, frozen ocean deep inside him, suddenly struck by lightning. It awakened with a ravenous, predatory hunger, latching onto his demigod essence not to destroy it, but to merge with it, twisting it into something new, something terrifying. The salt water in his veins felt like it was turning to ice, then to razor-sharp crimson crystals. The thirst, it was a living thing, a clawing beast in the pit of his stomach demanding to be fed. Less than control the thirst. Greater than the voice echoed, fainter now. Less than it will be your first and greatest battle. Rule it, or it will rule you. Use what I have given you. See the world not as it is, but as a current of energy. Bend it to your will. Be the predator, not the prey, greater than. The grip on his arm loosened. Percy fell back, gasping, his body trembling violently. He looked up. Valerius was almost gone, his body little more than a silhouette of crumbling ash. His crimson eyes met Percy's one last time, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction passing through them. Less than, live, Lord Percy Jackson. Greater than, and with that final, fading thought, he dissolved completely, his ashes scattered by the wind and the rain, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of dust and old blood. Percy lay on the wet asphalt, his mind a maelstrom of alien memories and roaring, newfound instincts. He felt like his very DNA was being rewritten. The world was screaming at him. He could hear the frantic heartbeat of a rat hiding in a drainpipe 3 blocks away. He could smell the faint, lingering perfume on a woman's coat as she walked past the end of the alley, the tang of the cheap wine on her breath. He could see the intricate web of a spider glistening with raindrops on the fire escape above him, each individual strand perfectly defined in the near-total darkness. He scrambled to his feet, his bow, feeling both lighter and immensely more powerful than before. He felt a deep, gnawing emptiness in his stomach, a hunger so profound it was painful. It wasn't for food. His new instincts, the memories of Valerius, told him exactly what it was for. Blood, life, essence. He stumbled out of the alley, his mind reeling. He saw his reflection in a murky puddle on the sidewalk. His face was pale, his features seemingly etched with a new, sharper definition. But his eyes, his sea-green eyes now held flecks of crimson, like blood dropped into the ocean, and they seemed to glow with a faint, internal light. He was a monster, a different kind of monster. A primal panic seized him, and he ran. He ran without thinking, his legs pumping with a speed and endurance he'd never possessed. He moved like a wraith through the sleeping city, a blur in the periphery. He needed the sea, he needed his father's domain. It was the only place he'd ever felt truly whole. He reached the East River in what felt like seconds. The familiar scent of salt and pollution filled his lungs, but even that was different now. He could smell the life within the water, the schools of fish, the algae, the very life force of the river itself. Without hesitation, he walked towards the water's edge. His foot touched the surface, and he braced himself to sink, but he didn't. He stood on the choppy, dark water as if it were solid ground. He'd done this before, but it had always taken concentration, a conscious exertion of his will. This was different. This was effortless, instinctive. He took another step, then another. Walking out towards the center of the river, he felt the new energy coiling in his gut, the cold, sharp power that Valerius had forced upon him. He thought of the manga, of the shinobi Focusin. Their chakra to their feet to walk on water. He reached for that feeling, that alien power inside him, and focused it downwards. The water beneath his soles became as unyielding as concrete. He closed his eyes, taking a shuddering breath. He was Percy Jackson, son of Poseidon, demigod, hero of Olympus. But he was also something else. Something ancient, predatory, and powerful. A legacy of shadows had been thrust upon him. He looked down at his hands. His shadow, cast by the distant city lights, stretched long and distorted on the water's surface. As he watched, a flicker of his will caused it to deepen, to twist, to rise from the water like a tangible thing. He was no longer just a demigod, a pawn in a divine game. He had been given a new, terrible power, and with it, a choice. He could be a monster, ruled by the thirst. Or he could be something else. He could be a lord, a king in his own right. Standing there, on the black water of the East River, under the indifferent gaze of the moon. Percy Jackson felt the broken pieces of his spirit begin to shift. They were not healing. They were rearranging themselves, being forged into a new shape by a cold, crimson fire. For the first time since Lee Fletcher had died, he didn't feel helpless. He felt a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. A purpose. The gods had their world, with their rules and their sacrifices. Fine. He would build his own. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The Weight of a Crown. The first week of his new existence was a private, silent war waged in the shadows of a derelict waterfront warehouse. The thirst was a constant, living entity. A serpent coiling in his gut. It whispered to him in the language of heartbeats. Walking through the city was a unique form of torment. Every mortal was a symphony of life, a pulsing, rhythmic beat of blood flowing through veins, a scent of warmth and vitality that called to the predator Valerius had awakened within him. He saw the world in a new spectrum, the faint, shimmering aura of life force that clung to every living thing, a tantalizing feast laid out before a starving man. To fight it, he turned to the only source of discipline he could think of, the memories of shinobi and the sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness that was uniquely his own. Valerius's mind was a vast, ancient library, but its knowledge was instinctual, honed over millennia of predatory existence. Percy needed to translate it, to systematize it, to impose the will of Percy Jackson over the instincts of a vampire lord. He started with the principles he'd read in the manga. Control, precision, the foundation of all techniques. He found a single, cracked skylight in the warehouse roof that led in a sliver of moonlight. He stood under it, pricked his own thumb with a shard of glass, and squeezed out a single, perfect drop of his now crimson-flecked blood. It hovered in the air before him, a perfect sphere held aloft by a thread of his will. The goal, inspired by a leaf-sticking exercise from his books, was simple: to hold it, to command it, to make it an extension of himself. The first few hours were agony. The thirst screamed at the sight of his own essence, demanding he consume it, that he consume more. His concentration would break, and the drop would splatter against the grimy concrete floor. But Percy was no stranger to impossible tasks. He'd held up the sky. He could hold a single drop of blood. He focused not on the hunger, but on the energy within him. Valerius had called it blood, but it was more than that. It was his life force, his demigod essence, his very soul. All supercharged and corrupted into something new. It was his chakra. He channeled it, pushing it out of his body, not with the explosive force of a tidal wave, but with the delicate touch of a master sculptor. He made the drop of blood spin, flatten into a disc, elongate into a needle. He was learning the grammar of his new power. But control wasn't enough. He needed sustenance. He wouldn't, prey on mortals. The thought was a line of cold iron he knew he could never cross. But the hunger was beginning to fray his sanity, sharpening the world into a stark landscape of predator and prey. He was the former, and everything with a pulse was the latter. Then, a memory from Valerius surfaced. It was a memory of a lean time, centuries ago, when the vampire had been hunted and cut off from his usual territory. He had survived by feeding on the lesser creatures of the night. Wraiths, ghouls, the monstrous beasts that dwelled in the dark places of the world. Their essence was crude, a pale imitation of the rich vitality of a mortal, but it was enough. It was sustenance without damnation. Monsters. Percy could work with that. That night, he went hunting. He didn't need to search for long. The scent of sulfur and rot led him to a trio of hellhounds stalking a homeless encampment under the FDR Drive. In his old life, this would have been a fight, a whirlwind of bronze and snapping teeth. Now, it was a harvest. He moved with a speed that felt less like running and more like a form of localized teleportation. Before the first hellhound could even register his presence, he was on it. He didn't use Riptide. He didn't need it. His fingers, hardened by his will, became claws of shadow-laced steel. He drove his hand through the creature's side, not with rage, but with a cold, surgical precision. As the hellhound began to dissolve into golden dust, Percy focused. He felt its life essence, a chaotic, fiery energy, trying to dissipate and return to Tartarus. He pulled. It was a new, alien sensation. Like inhaling not with his lungs but with his entire being. The golden light swirled, drawn from the dissolving monster and into his body through the point of contact. It wasn't warm or satisfying like food. It was like drinking static, a gritty, bitter energy that nevertheless quelled the screaming serpent in his gut. The thirst receded to a dull, manageable ache. He patched the other two with the same brutal efficiency, absorbing their essence before their bodies fully disintegrated. He stood over the last cloud of swirling dust, feeling the raw, chaotic energy settle within him. It was a poor substitute for what his instincts truly craved, like drinking mud when you were thirsty for wine, but it worked. He had found a way. He could survive. He could be his own master. He spent the next 2 weeks honing his new reality. By day, he slept, a deep, dreamless torpor that was a welcome respite from the constant nightmares of Lee's death. By night, he trained. He mastered shadow travel, not the clumsy, exhausting jumps Nico had shown him, but a fluid, instantaneous movement through any patch of darkness. He learned to manipulate the mist on a grand scale, weaving illusions that were indistinguishable from reality. He practiced combining his abilities, creating walls of super-chilled water using his vampiric cold and his demigod hydrokinesis. He was becoming a weapon, forged in grief and tempered by discipline. He was in the middle of his training, effortlessly weaving between concrete pillars in the cavernous warehouse at speeds that would have broken the sound barrier. When he felt them, 3 demigod life auras, approaching from the street. They were bright, familiar, and heading directly for him. He came to a dead stop in the center of the warehouse. A whisper of displaced air the only sign of his movement. He straightened his dark hoodie, smoothed the calm mask over his face, and waited. The massive steel loading door groaned open, pushed by the unmistakable strength of a child of Ares. Clarice LaRue stepped in, clad in her usual combat fatigues, her electric spear, Maimer, crackling softly in her hand. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, swept the darkness. Behind her, her spear glinting in the faint light from the street, was Annabeth Chase. Her gray eyes, usually filled with strategic calculations, were clouded with worry. She clutched the hilt of her Dracon bone sword. Bringing up the rear, looking more awkward than threatening, was Connor Stoll, holding a small, intricate bronze device that was likely a magical tracker of some kind. "Percy," Annabeth called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. "We know you're in here. Chiron is worried sick. We're all worried." Percy remained in the central darkness, letting them walk further into his domain. He watched them, not as friends, but as a strategist assessing potential threats. Clarice was the muscle, direct and predictable. Connor was the wild card, a saboteur. Annabeth was the true danger, the leader, the strategist, the one who knew him best. "I'm fine, Annabeth," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the space with an unnatural clarity, seeming to come from all directions at once. They all jumped, spinning to face the source of the sound, but he was no longer there. He had melted into the shadow of a massive pillar behind them. "Stop playing games, Jackson," Clarice snarled, brandishing her spear. "Show yourself. Chiron sent us to bring you home." "This is my home now," Percy replied, his voice now coming from their left. He enjoyed this, just a little. The shinobi tactics of misdirection and psychological pressure felt as natural to him as breathing. Annabeth held up a hand, silencing Clarice. "Percy, please, we just want to talk. What happened on that quest? It wasn't your fault. You can't just disappear." "I'm not disappearing," Percy said, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the sliver of moonlight in the center of the room. "I'm focusing." They stared at him. He knew what they saw. He was paler, his features sharper. The sea green of his eyes was still there, but it was now a turbulent ocean under a blood-red sunset. He held himself with an unnerving stillness, a coiled tension that spoke of immense power held in perfect check. The goofy, impulsive boy they knew was gone. In his place stood something older, colder. "Focusing on what?" Annabeth asked, taking a hesitant step forward. "Percy, what's happened to you?" "I've had a change in perspective," he said calmly. "I've come to realize that serving the gods is a fool's errand. We're their messengers, their soldiers, their janitors. We fight and bleed and die for their petty squabbles, and what's our reward? A pat on the head and a, 'Well done, lad,' before they send us out to die again." The bitterness in his voice was a cold, hard thing. Clarice snorted. "Life's tough. Get a helmet. You think you're the only one who's ever lost someone. We're warriors. It's what we do." "No," Percy countered, his gaze locking onto hers. "We're sacrifices. There's a difference. A warrior chooses their battles. We have our battles chosen for us." Before the argument could escalate, a deafening roar echoed from outside, followed by the crunch of metal and the shattering of glass. A wave of heat washed into the warehouse, carrying the triple scent of lion, snake, and goat. "Chimera," Annabeth breathed, her hand tightening on her sword. 2 more shapes, massive and dark, bounded through the now mangled doorway. "Hellhounds. One for each of them." A classic monster squad ambush. Looks like your new home has a pest problem, Jackson, Clarice grinned, a savage light in her eyes. Perfect. I was hoping for a workout. She charged the nearest hellhound. Connor yelped and drew his own sword, backing up behind Annabeth, who was already moving to intercept the second hound, her mind clearly working on the optimal strategy to take on 3 monsters in an enclosed space. They were about to fight like demigods. Percy was going to fight like a king. Stay back, he commanded. The words were not a request. They were an order, imbued with a sliver of the unnatural authority Valerius had possessed. To his surprise, both Annabeth and Clarice hesitated for a split second, their battle instincts momentarily overridden by the sheer command in his tone. That second was all he needed. He reached for the nearest water main, a thick, rusted pipe running along the ceiling. With a flick of his will, it burst, not in a single explosion, but in thousands of tiny perforations. A dense, billowing fog of ice-cold mist filled the entire warehouse in seconds, dropping visibility to near zero. What the Hades? Clarice sputtered, blinded. Annabeth was smarter. It's Percy. He's using it as cover. Stay together. But Percy wasn't using it for cover. He was using it as a medium. The world became a landscape of sound and vibration to his heightened senses. He could feel the heavy footfalls of the chimera, the panting breaths of the hellhounds, the frantic, spiking heartbeats of his friends. He was everywhere at once. He moved into the mist. He became a ghost. The first hellhound never even saw him coming. One moment it was sniffing the air, trying to locate Annabeth. The next, a tendril of pure, solid shadow erupted from the ground and coiled around its throat, silencing its bark and lifting it into the air. With a casual, brutal clench of his will, the shadow tendril snapped the creature's neck. As its essence began to dissipate, he absorbed it silently, a flicker of cold energy to fuel the fire. The second hellhound lunged at the sound, biting at empty air where the first had been. Percy was already behind it. He didn't bother with shadows this time. He simply placed a hand on its back. A wave of intense, deathly cold radiated from his palm, freezing the monster solid from the inside out in a heartbeat. It stood for a moment, a perfect statue of black fur and snarling teeth, before crumbling into a pile of frozen dust. 2 down. Maybe 5 seconds had passed. Annabeth and Clarice stood back to back, swords and spear ready. Turning in tight circles, trying to pierce the oppressive fog. They knew the hounds were gone. They had felt the familiar sensation of monsters returning to Tartarus. Then came the chimera. It bellowed in frustration and unleashed a torrent of fire into the mist, a blind, sweeping attack that momentarily cleared the fog around it. It illuminated Percy, standing 20 feet away, perfectly still, his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. The chimera locked its lion eyes on him and charged. Clarice yelled his name, a genuine warning. Annabeth started to move, to intercept. They were too slow. Percy hadn't moved a muscle. He simply watched the 10-ton monster bear down on him, its goat head bleeding and its snake tail hissing, dripping venom that sizzled on the concrete. Just as the chimera's gaping, fiery maw was about to close on him, he vanished. Not in a blur of speed, but by simply dissolving into the shadow cast by one of the pillars and instantly reforming in the shadow cast by another. Now directly behind the charging beast. He flowed out of the darkness, a whisper of movement. The chimera, still hurtling forward with unstoppable momentum, had no time to react. Percy leapt onto its back, his feet making no sound. He ignored the lashing snake tail and the bleeding goat. He drove his right hand deep into the thick muscle of the lion's neck, his fingers sinking in as if through wet clay until they found the spinal column. He didn't pull or twist. He just flooded the creature with his power. A wave of vampiric energy, cold and utterly inimical to the fiery life of the chimera, poured into its nervous system. The monster's roar died in its throat, turning into a choked gurgle. It shuddered violently, its legs buckling. The fire in its throat extinguished. In a matter of seconds, the great beast collapsed, not dead, but completely and utterly paralyzed, its malevolent consciousness trapped inside a body that would no longer obey. The mist began to settle as the broken pipe's pressure died. Annabeth and Clarice stared, their weapons half lowered, their faces etched with disbelief. They hadn't seen a fight. They had seen an execution. It was brutally, terrifyingly efficient. There had been no struggle, no heroic effort. Just a predator dispatching its prey. Percy stood on the chimera's back, his hand still buried in its neck. He looked at them, his crimson-flecked eyes glowing in the gloom. He focused, and the last, most potent part of the monster's essence flowed into him, a thick, heady rush of power that made his head swim for a second. The chimera's body dissolved into a massive cloud of golden dust, leaving Percy standing alone in the center of the room. Silence, heavy and absolute. Finally, Annabeth lowered her sword. That was, she started, but couldn't find the word. What was that? Clarice demanded, her bravado gone, replaced by a genuine, unnerving confusion. She was the best fighter at camp, and what she had just witnessed was not a style she could comprehend, let alone counter. You didn't even use your sword. I'm adapting, Percy said, walking towards them. He pulled his hand from his hoodie pocket. It was clean, not a speck of monster dust on it. I told you, a new perspective. He stopped before them, his gaze steady. This was a test, wasn't it? Sent to see what I could do. Or, maybe just to kill me if I didn't measure up. Annabeth flinched. No, Percy, of course not. We would never. Not you, he clarified. Them. The gods. Who sent the welcome party? Your father. He asked Clarice. Seems like his style. Clarice actually looked uncertain. He told me to be ready for a fight. He didn't say he was sending one. It doesn't matter, Percy said, his voice dropping, losing its edge and gaining a weight that was far more intimidating. It's the last test I'll be taking for them. The last errand I'll be running. He looked directly at Annabeth, his expression clear and absolute. Go back to camp. Tell Chiron that I'm grateful for everything. Tell him I'll always be a friend to the campers. When a threat arises that endangers them, or endangers the mortal world, I will be there to fight it. But I will do it on my own terms. He held her gaze, letting the finality of his words sink in. I am not a hero of Olympus anymore. I don't serve the gods. I don't answer to them. I answer to myself. My name is Percy Jackson, and I am free. He turned his back on them then, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He walked deeper into the shadows of the warehouse, leaving his old friend standing in a stunned tableau of confusion, awe, and a dawning, terrible fear that the boy they had come to save was already gone, replaced by a man who had the power and the will to crown himself king. Far away, in a place that was everywhere and nowhere, Hermes, the messenger god, leaned over a pool of shimmering water. The scene in the warehouse reflected perfectly on its surface. He wore a simple, modern business suit, and a faint, unreadable smile played on his lips. He watched Percy's declaration, watched Annabeth's heartbroken face, watched Clarice's grudging respect. He had, of course, arranged the monsters. It had been trivially easy to nudge a chimera and a few hounds toward a specific mortal location. Ares had been a useful, if unwitting, scapegoat for the motivation. It had been a risk. The boy could have died. He could have broken. But Hermes's gamble had paid off. The pressure had not shattered the demigod, it had forged him into something new. Something powerful, something independent. A necessary test, he murmured to himself, the surface of the pool rippling with his voice. And he passed with flying colors. He waved a hand, and the image dissolved. The old order of Olympus was stagnant, brittle, coasting on ancient victories and suffocated by pride. Zeus was paranoid, Poseidon was passive, and the rest were too caught up in our own petty domains to see the cracks forming in the foundation of their world. A new power was rising, a sun-scorched king from a forgotten age, and Olympus was not ready. But a catalyst had just been created. A rogue piece on the board, unbound by the old rules. The board is set, Hermes said, a flicker of genuine excitement in his ancient eyes. Now, let the game begin. Chapter 2 end. Chapter 3. The Crimson Tide. The old world was built on foundations of bronze and faith. Percy's new world was being built on concrete, steel, and shadow. He found his fortress in the drowned ruins of a Cold War-era submarine pen. A massive concrete monolith swallowed by the Atlantic just off the coast of Long Island, forgotten by the mortal world and deemed uninhabitable by the sea folk. The crushing G-pressure at that depth would have turned a normal demigod into paste, but for Percy, it was a comforting embrace. The cold was absolute, a perfect match for the icy stillness that now lived in his veins. The darkness was his native element, a canvas on which to practice his art. He cleared it of its monstrous denizens with a silent, ruthless efficiency that became his new routine. A colony of Dracaena, ancient sea serpent women who had taken up residence in the rusted control rooms, were dispatched not with a sword, but with localized pockets of absolute zero, freezing them in their tracks. Before their essence was quietly harvested, a rogue cyclops, forging shoddy weapons in the geothermal heat of a deep-sea vent nearby, was blinded by a perfectly crafted illusion of 1,000 attacking sharks while Percy simply walked up and touched the back of his neck, draining his life force until the lumbering giant collapsed into a cloud of dust. This was his domain now, a kingdom of one, built in pressure and darkness. He spent his nights, the perpetual twilight of the deep, exploring the limits of his new physiology. He didn't need to breathe. The ambient pressure didn't affect him. He could see in the abyssal dark as clearly as a mortal could in daylight. He moved through the water not by swimming, but by willing the currents to carry him, a silent, crimson-eyed ghost patrolling the trenches. He was a protector, as he had promised, but his protection was that of a predator carving out its territory. Lesser sea monsters learned to fear the sudden, unnatural cold that preceded High's arrival and soon gave his section of the ocean a wide, terrified berth. He was meditating, suspended in the water column in the vast, echoing central chamber of the sub-pen, when the summons came. It wasn't a whisper on the currents or an iris message. It was a raw, undeniable exertion of divine will. The water around him, his very element, turned against him. It was no longer a gentle medium he commanded, but a cage of crushing, irresistible pressure. Every drop of water for 100 miles screamed a single, thunderous command, "Come." It was his father, not asking, not requesting, demanding. Percy's eyes snapped open, the crimson flecks within them glowing with annoyance. The old him would have been frightened, or at least awed. The new him was simply irritated by the lack of subtlety. This was a leash, a reminder that for all his newfound power, he was still, by blood, a part of a world that believed it owned him. He didn't fight the pull. That would be a pointless, exhausting struggle. Instead, he relaxed, allowing the immense pressure of his father's will to guide him. He was pulled from his sanctum and propelled through the ocean at a terrifying speed. The underwater world blurred past him, a smear of bioluminescent life and deep-sea geography. As he traveled, he extended his senses, the senses Valerius had given him, and felt the state of his father's kingdom. He felt fear, not the healthy respect for a powerful god, but a gnawing, pervasive anxiety that vibrated through the water itself. He saw schools of fish darting nervously for no reason, heard the low, mournful songs of whales tinged with a note of panic, and sensed a tension in the merfolk patrols they passed, their movements too sharp, their grips on their tridents too tight. The kingdom of Poseidon was on edge. The pull deposited him unceremoniously at the gates of Atlantis. The city was a breathtaking sight, a metropolis of shimmering pearl and living coral, glowing with a soft, internal light. But even here, the tension was palpable. The guards at the gate, mermen with fish tails and stern, bearded faces, regarded him not as a prince, but as a contaminant. Their eyes lingered on the unnatural pallor of his skin and the crimson glow in his eyes. He heard them whispering as he was escorted through the city, "Abomination, creature of the night, blood drinker." The throne room was no different. It was a vast cavern, its ceiling an open view of the ocean above, where whales and sharks drifted like clouds. Poseidon sat on a massive throne of black pearl, his expression stormy, his iconic trident gripped in his hand. He was flanked by his wife, Amphitrite, whose expression was one of undisguised revulsion, and his son Triton, who looked at Percy with the open contempt of a pure-blooded heir for a half-breed bastard. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, Perseus," Poseidon's voice boomed, the sound of grinding tectonic plates. "You defy Olympus. You slay monsters using methods that are unnatural. You declare yourself a king. Explain yourself." Percy walked to the center of the throne room, his footsteps silent on the mosaic floor. He stopped and met his father's gaze, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. "There is nothing to explain," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the heavy, oppressive atmosphere. "I simply no longer wish to be a pawn in a game I have no stake in. I have chosen to take responsibility for my own life, and for the safety of those I care about." Responsibility. Triton sneered, swimming forward. His two fish tails swished in agitation. You are a demigod of the sea. Your responsibility is to me, to your father, to this kingdom. You have abandoned your duties. What duties? Percy countered, turning his cool gaze on his half-brother. The duty to die on some god's errand. The duty to be sent into a situation with faulty intelligence and watch my friends die. I fulfilled those duties. My term of service is over. He looked back to Poseidon. I am not your enemy. I have no quarrel with Atlantis or with you. I am simply independent. Poseidon's eyes narrowed. There is no independence for those of our blood. You are either with Olympus, or you are against it. That's a very narrow worldview, Percy noted. And it's the reason your kingdom is terrified. The entire court gasped. Triton's hand went to the hilt of his sword. Poseidon's knuckles turned white on his trident. What did you say? You heard me, Percy said, his voice never rising, but his intensity growing. I felt at the moment you summoned me. A cancer of fear is spreading through your domain. Your patrols are stretched thin, your people are anxious. There is a threat in your waters that you are failing to contain, and you are all too proud or too blind to see it. That is why you summoned me. Not for my defiance, but because you are desperate. The throne room was utterly silent. Percy had taken his father's display of power and turned it back on him, exposing the weakness behind the bluster. Poseidon stared at his son, truly seeing him for the first time. This was not the loyal, hot-headed boy he knew. This was a man, cold and perceptive, who stood in the heart of Atlantis and spoke truth to its king. There was a long, tense moment where the fate of the world seemed to hang on the sea god's temper. Finally, a slow, grim smile touched Poseidon's lips. You have your mother's courage, he said, his voice losing its thunder and gaining a note of grudging respect. And a new clarity. You are right. There is a threat, an ancient one, a kraken, one of the old brood, has awakened. It has destroyed the trade route to the Mediterranean and devoured two of my best patrols. My champion, Thyreus, has faced it. Wyson returned with nothing but a shattered shield and a broken spirit. Percy simply listened, his expression unchanged. You want to prove your new worth? Poseidon challenged, his eyes gleaming. You want to carve out your own territory? Then do this for me. For us. Slay this beast that my own armies cannot. Do this, and I will grant you what you ask. I will recognize your sovereignty over the North Atlantic shelf. From here to the mortal coastline. You will be your own master, in your own waters, with my blessing. But if you fail, you will return here, bend the knee, and accept your place as a soldier of the sea. It was an impossible task. A test designed to break him and force him back into line. I don't need your blessing, Percy stated calmly. And I will not bend the knee. But I will kill your monster. The shipping lanes are used by mortals as well. Its presence endangers them, and that makes it my business. He turned his gaze to the assembled court. Consider it a professional courtesy. From one lord of the sea to another. Without waiting for dismissal, he turned and walked out of the throne room, leaving a stunned court and a deeply conflicted sea god in his wake. Finding the kraken was the easy part. Percy didn't need charts or trackers. He descended into the abyssal plain and simply listened. He filtered out the noise of the ocean, the songs of the whales and the chatter of the dolphins. And focused on the discordant notes, the sound of fear. He followed the panicked flight of deep-sea creatures, a trail of terror that led him to a vast, lightless trench. There, it lay in wait. It was a mountain of living flesh, its skin the color of a deep bruise, its immense body nestled between two undersea mesas. Its tentacles, each one as thick as a skyscraper, lay coiled and still, disguised as part of the canyon. And its eye, a single, vast, luminous orb the size of a Ferris wheel, swiveled slowly in the dark, radiating a malevolent, ancient intelligence. The heroic approach would be a frontal assault. A charge with riptide, a challenge to the beast. Percy didn't even consider it. That was the demigod way. He was something else now. He sank into a crevice in the seafloor, cloaking himself in the trench's natural shadow. He was 100 yards from the creature, yet it had no idea he was there. He observed. He learned. He saw the pattern of its breathing, the slow, rhythmic pulse of water through its massive gills. He saw the way it favored one side, where a deep, half-healed scar from a previous battle marred its hide. That would be Thyrius's work. A wound that only served to anger the beast. Percy began to weave his trap. He didn't summon a storm. He manipulated the deep-sea currents. Slowly, imperceptibly, he began to alter the flow of water around the canyon, creating a gentle but persistent vortex. He didn't have the raw power to move the beast, but he didn't need to. He just needed to change its environment, to make it uncomfortable. Then, he reached for the mist. He gathered the ambient magic of the deep ocean and wove a grand illusion. A colossal great white shark, larger than any that had ever lived, bleeding from a dozen wounds, appeared at the edge of the trench, swimming erratically as if in its death throes. It was the perfect bait. A large, wounded, easy meal. The kraken's massive eyes swiveled and fixed on the illusion. A low, hungry rumble echoed through the water. Slowly, one of its immense tentacles began to uncoil, rising from the canyon floor to snatch the promised meal. As the tentacle swept past him, Percy moved. He became a streak of pure shadow, darting from his hiding place and latching onto the limb. The kraken didn't even feel him. He moved along the vast expanse of its skin, a flea on the back of a whale, his vampiric abilities allowing him to cling to the surface effortlessly. He raced along the tentacle toward the main body, the single, luminous eye his target. But as he drew closer, he felt it. A faint, almost unnoticeable taint on the creature's life force. It was the same scorching, sun-like energy he'd felt from the creature in the alley. It was faint, but it was there, like a splinter of burning light buried deep in the kraken's psyche. It wasn't just awake, it had been prodded, irritated, driven into a frenzy by an outside force. Lycurgus's influence had reached even here, into the deepest dark. This changed things. This wasn't just a monster hunt. This was an extermination of a potential weapon. He reached the base of the kraken's mantle, just below its colossal eye. The illusionary shark had served its purpose and now dissolved into the mist. The kraken, realizing it had been tricked, began to move, its fury building. The entire canyon began to tremble. Percy didn't give it the chance to rage. He placed both his hands on the creature's rubbery hide. He closed his eyes and unleashed his power. Not hydrokinesis, not shadow. He unleashed the full, terrifying force of his vampire lord heritage. It wasn't an attack, it was an invasion. An aura of absolute, unnatural cold erupted from him. The water in a 50-foot radius around him instantly froze, encasing a portion of the kraken's head in a shell of black ice. At the same time, he drove his will, his very essence, into the monster. He wasn't just trying to kill it, he was draining it. The kraken convulsed, a titanic shudder that sent shockwaves through the water. It let out a silent, psychic scream of pure agony. Its life force, an immense reservoir of ancient, primal energy, was being siphoned out of it. Drawn into Percy like a river flowing into a thirsty sea. He felt its millennia of memories, the slow, ponderous thoughts of a creature that was practically a geological feature. He felt its rage, its hunger. And beneath it all, the burning, irritating speck of sun-scorched energy that had driven it mad. He targeted that speck, surrounding it with his own cold, dark power, snuffing it out like a candle flame. The monster's frantic thrashing slowed, its rage replaced by a vast, empty confusion. Its colossal eye began to dim, the internal light fading. Percy pushed harder, absorbing the creature's essence with a ravenous hunger he hadn't felt since his first week. It was a heady, intoxicating torrent of power, ancient and pure. The kraken's vast body went limp, its tentacles uncoiling and settling on the canyon floor with a final, shuddering finality. Its light went out for good. It was dead, not just dead, it was an empty husk, its life force utterly consumed. Percy pulled back, his body thrumming with the raw power he had just ingested. He felt stronger, faster, the cold fire in his veins burning brighter than ever. He floated in the darkness, the massive, dead god beast before him. And felt not pride, but a cold, hard certainty. He didn't return to Atlantis. He had no need to prove himself. They would know. Instead, he returned to his dark fortress. The stolen power of the kraken settling within him. As he sifted through the chaotic energy, he isolated the last vestiges of the sun-scorched taint. It was alien, an energy of pure, fanatical order. An energy that sought to burn away anything it deemed impure. Anything hybrid, anything like him. His deal with Poseidon had granted him a kingdom. But his battle with the Kraken had shown him the true face of the coming war. It wasn't a war for Olympus. It was a war for survival. And his new, dark kingdom was on the front lines. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. A Dance of Shadows and Sunlight. The power of the Kraken settled within him like a second, deeper ocean. It was a vast, primal energy that Percy spent the next month learning to navigate. He was no longer just a demigod with a vampiric overlay, he was a true hybrid. The two halves of his nature merging into a seamless, terrifying whole. His control over water was no longer just a matter of will, it was instinct. The sea was not just his domain, it was his circulatory system. An extension of his own body. He became the ghost of the North Atlantic shelf. He patrolled his new kingdom, not from a throne, but from the currents themselves. He found a mortal smuggling vessel. A rusty trawler running not with drugs or weapons, but with captured magical creatures bound for the black market. A cage full of whimpering pegasi, their wings cruelly bound. A tank containing a young hippocampus, thrashing in terror. The old Percy would have boarded the ship, a storm at his back and a sword in his hand. The new Percy was more subtle. He didn't show himself at all. He wrapped the ship in a thick, unnatural fog that swallowed all sound. From the depths, he wove illusions into the mist. The smugglers saw the ghosts of sailors drowned in these waters. Their spectral forms rising from the waves, their eyes accusing. They heard the whispers of their own deepest fears given voice on the wind. Within an hour, the hardened criminals were huddled in their cabin, weeping and praying to gods they hadn't thought of in years. Percy then simply nudged a current, guiding the ghost ship and its terrified crew gently towards the nearest coast UARD patrol route before freeing the creatures and guiding them back to the wild. He hadn't harmed a soul, but he had delivered a far more potent message than a sword ever could. This is my water. You are not welcome here. His actions did not go unnoticed. He was a rogue variable, an unchecked power operating outside the ancient, established rules. And there was one god, above all others, for whom such an imbalance was a personal, aesthetic offense. The confrontation came, as Percy knew it must, with the rising of the sun. He was on a remote, desolate island at the edge of his acknowledged territory. A jagged spear of black volcanic rock that clawed its way out of the sea. He had come here to feel the sun, to test his limits. He was a creature of the night, but he was not its slave. The daylight no longer burned him as it had Valerius. His demigod half, his connection to the living, breathing world, provided a unique resilience. It was uncomfortable, a constant, low-level irritation like a wool sweater on sunburned skin. And his power was noticeably diminished, but it was not fatal. He felt the god's approach before he saw it. It was a crescendo of oppressive energy, a wave of heat and power that made the very air hum. The shadows cast by the rocks around him seemed to shrink, to physically recoil in fear. The dawn, which had been a gentle blush of pink and orange on the horizon, suddenly exploded with the intensity of a solar flare. A chariot of pure, condensed sunlight descended from the sky, pulled by 4 horses made of living fire. It landed on the highest point of the island, and from it stepped Apollo. He was not in his casual, mortal disguise. This was the god in his full, terrifying glory. His skin glowed with an internal luminescence, his golden hair was a chaotic halo of solar energy. And his eyes were chips of the sun itself, radiating a power that was both beautiful and utterly deadly. Abomination, Apollo's voice rang out, not as speech, but as a chord of music so perfect it was painful. I have come to cleanse this stain from my father's sea. Percy didn't move from his spot on the black sand beach. He simply tilted his head, his crimson FL-ect eyes meeting the god's blinding gaze without flinching. I was wondering when you'd show up, Apollo. I figured my existence would offend your sense of order. Apollo's perfect face twisted into a sneer. Order. This isn't about order. It's about purity. You are a corruption. A demigod hero who has allowed himself to become a leech, a parasite of the night. You have broken the pact. I am here to put you down. He raised a hand, and a bow of golden light materialized in it. An arrow, nothing more than a solidified sunbeam, was knocked and drawn in a single, fluid motion. This will be quicker than you deserve, the god said. A mercy. The arrow left the bow with a sound like a thunderclap. It didn't fly. It simply ceased to be at the bow and appeared a foot from Percy's chest. But Percy was already gone. He had dropped backwards, not into the sand, but through it, sinking into his own shadow as if it were an open manhole. The arrow of light struck the beach, and the black sand in a 10-foot radius was instantly vitrified, turning into a crater of jagged, smoking glass. Percy reformed from the shadow of a tall, basalt spire 50 yards to the left. "You're going to have to be faster than that," he said. His voice calm. Apollo's eyes narrowed. He unleashed a volley, not one arrow, but a dozen, each one moving with the same impossible speed. The beach became a hellscape of exploding light and molten rock. Percy became a phantom. He didn't try to outrun the attacks. He simply flowed from one patch of darkness to the next, a staccato dance of evasion. A sliver of light grazed his arm, and his hoodie sizzled. The skin beneath blistering instantly. The pain was sharp, clean, and energizing. "You can't hide in the shadows forever, creature," Apollo snarled, advancing. "The sun is rising. Soon, you will have nowhere left to run." He was right. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows shrank, becoming little more than thin, useless lines at the base of the rocks. Percy was being corralled, his options dwindling with every passing minute. Apollo was toying with him, enjoying the hunt, forcing him into the open. The raw, divine power radiating from the god was a physical force, pressing down on him, making his vampiric senses scream in protest. Percy knew he couldn't win this way. A battle of attrition against the sun itself was a battle he was guaranteed to lose. Brute force was out. He couldn't match the raw power output of a major Olympian at the peak of his strength. This wasn't a duel of demigods. This had to be a contest of shinobi. He stopped his retreat and stood his ground on an open patch of rock. "You're right," he called out, his voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "No more hiding." Apollo smiled. "A cruel, beautiful thing. Finally come to your senses. Good. Die with some dignity." He raised his bow for the final shot. "I was just thinking the same thing," Percy said. He looked not at Apollo, but just over his shoulder, his eyes widening in feigned shock and grief. "Lee," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry. I was too slow." For a single, fatal heartbeat, Apollo's divine arrogance was pierced by curiosity. Who was Lee? Why that name? He instinctively glanced over his shoulder. There was nothing there, of course. But the hesitation was all Percy needed. The world around Apollo shimmered. The mist, ever present over the ocean, was no longer a passive element. Percy seized it, weaving it with his will, turning the entire island into his personal genjutsu stage. The illusion that flooded Apollo's senses was not of a monster or a threat. It was a memory. The air filled with the scent of laurel trees and the sound of panicked, ragged breathing. A beautiful, terrified nymph with eyes the color of fresh moss appeared before him. Her hands outstretched. "Please," Daphne whispered, her voice an echo of a forgotten tragedy. "Leave me be." Apollo froze, his golden eyes widening in shock. This was his deepest, most profound failure, a moment of selfish desire that had ended in tragedy, a wound on his pride that had never truly healed. Percy didn't attack, he moved. While the god was ensnared in the phantom memory, Percy shot forward, his diminished speed still a blur to any mortal eye. He wasn't aiming for Apollo. He was aiming for the water. He dove into the surf, the cold Atlantic Sea, a shocking but welcome relief from the god's oppressive heat. He didn't swim away. He reached out with his power, pulling on the water around him, shaping it. Apollo shattered the illusion with a roar of pure rage and grief. "You dare!" he bellowed, his form glowing with such intensity that the water around the island began to steam. "You will pay for that insolence." He turned to incinerate the spot where Percy had been. But Percy was already putting the next phase of his plan into action. Dozens of perfect, crystalline lenses of seawater, each the size of a shield, rose from the ocean and hovered in the air between him and the god. Apollo unleashed a beam of pure, concentrated sunlight, a weapon that could have leveled a city. But it didn't strike Percy. It struck the first lens. The beam of light refracted, bending at an impossible angle and shooting off into the sky. He fired again, a wider blast. It hit a dozen lenses at once, and the single beam was shattered into a chaotic web of searing light that crisscrossed the island, slicing through rock spires and boiling the ocean where they touched down. It was a light show from hell, and Percy was its conductor. He stood waist-deep in the water, controlling the lenses, forcing Apollo's greatest weapon to become a liability, an unpredictable storm of his own making. The fight had changed. It was no longer a hunt. It was a dance. Percy was leading. Apollo, enraged and frustrated, abandoned his bow. He shot into the air, a golden comet, intending to simply obliterate the entire section of the island Percy was on. But Percy was ready. He looked up, and his eyes met the descending gods. He didn't project an illusion this time. He projected a single, clear thought, a memory from Valerius's library of souls, the psyche. See scream of a sun deity that the ancient vampire had consumed eons ago. For a fraction of a second, Apollo felt the terror of a star being extinguished. It was an alien, impossible feeling, and it broke his concentration. His descent faltered. In that moment of hesitation, Percy struck. He didn't use water or mist. He reached into the deepest, coldest part of himself, the vampire lord's essence. He pulled forth a sliver of pure, solid shadow, shaping it into a needle-thin, impossibly sharp projectile. It was a weapon made not of matter, but of absence, of cold, of night. He had a clear shot. Apollo was exposed, off balance. His divine focus shattered. The needle of shadow shot forward, aimed directly at the joint where Apollo's golden pauldron met his chest, at the complex web of muscle and sinew that controlled his archery arm. A single, perfect strike. He could cripple the god of archery for a century. A fitting irony. The part of him that still mourned Lee, the part that remembered Hermes's casual dismissal, screamed for him to do it. An eye for an eye. A son for a son. Let the gods feel the pain of loss for once. The shadow needle flew true. Apollo's eyes widened as he saw it coming, too late to dodge. But at the last possible nanosecond, Percy's will asserted itself. He was not a god. He would not be defined by petty vengeance and disproportionate retribution. He was forging a new path. To inflict such a wound would be to admit they were right about him, that he was nothing more than a monster. He gave the needle a minute, almost imperceptible nudge with his will. Instead of piercing the joint, the needle of shadow streaked past Apollo's arm, a mere hair's breadth away. It didn't draw blood, but it did something far more insulting. It sliced cleanly through the golden straps of his quiver and the leather of his bracer, the symbols of his power. The quiver, full of arrows of light, tumbled from his back and dissolved into motes of fading sunlight before it hit the water. His bracer fell away, leaving his arm bare. He had been disarmed, not defeated. Disarmed. It was a statement of ultimate control. Percy stood from the water and walked back onto the beach. The hovering lenses of water dissolving back into the sea. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The shadows were lengthening. The tide of the battle was turning with the tide of the world. Apollo landed on the beach, his chest heaving, not from exhaustion, but from sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at his bare arm, then at Percy. The fury was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't been in a fight for his life. He had been in a lecture. He had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and ultimately, shown mercy by the very creature he had come to destroy. The world is changing. Apollo, Percy said, his voice quiet, devoid of triumph. The shadows on the island were now reaching for him, flowing around his feet like loyal hounds. Power isn't the only thing that matters anymore. Strategy, control, choosing not to strike, that is true power. Apollo stared at him, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind the demigod. For the first time, perhaps in his entire immortal existence, the sun god had nothing to say. He had been so certain, so righteous. Now, all he felt was the sting of humiliation and a sliver of something cold and unfamiliar, doubt. Without another word, he vanished in a flash of fading, defeated light. Percy was left alone on the cooling rock of the island. He looked at his still blistered arm, the ONL. Why physical evidence of the confrontation? He had won. He had faced a major Olympian in his element and had not only survived but had dictated the terms of the engagement. He had made a powerful, bitter enemy today. But perhaps, he thought, he had also earned something else. Miles away, on the forested mainland, a silver-clad figure lowered a bow she had not fired. Artemis had watched the entire exchange, hidden and silent, ready to intervene to protect her foolish, arrogant twin. But she had stayed her hand. She had seen the creature of the night spare the god of light. She had witnessed a display of control and mercy that, she had to admit, she had rarely seen from her own kind. Her expression was thoughtful, intrigued. This son of Poseidon was an anomaly, a contradiction she did not yet understand. And the unknown, to the goddess of the hunt, was always the most compelling prey. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. The Underworld's Gambit. The deep ocean was a realm of perfect, silent black. In the heart of his submerged fortress, Percy sat not on a throne, but cross-legged in the water, suspended in the crushing pressure. He was sifting through the stolen power of the Kraken, sorting the raw, primal energy from the faint, lingering taint of the sun-scorched curse that had infected it. He was learning to identify his new enemy by its very essence, a signature of scorching, fanatical light that felt like a discordant scream in the quiet symphony of the sea. The summons, when it came, was not a roar of command like his father's. It was a violation, a subtle, creeping chill that had nothing to do with the abyssal cold. It was the cold of the grave, a dry, ancient cold that smelled of dust and finality. The shadows in the corners of the submarine pen, shadows that were his own domain, thickened and warped, coalescing into shapes that his new instincts screamed were wrong. They were not extensions of his power, they were intrusions. He opened his eyes. Floating in the water before him, glowing with a faint, sickly green light, was a single, ancient Greek coin made of Stygian iron. It was an obol, payment for the dead. It was not a request. It was a fare, with the destination already decided. Percy reached out and closed his hand around the coin. The moment his skin touched the metal, the world dissolved. He wasn't pulled or pushed. He was simply elsewhere. He bypassed the usual routes of the dead. There was no yawning cavern, no waiting line of confused souls, no grumbling ferryman demanding payment. He simply stepped out of a shadow that shouldn't have been here and found himself standing on a gray, desolate plain under a sky of smoke and regret. The fields of Asphodel, millions of shades drifted aimlessly around him, their faces blank, their movements sluggish. Trapped in an eternity of utter boredom. They paid him no mind, too lost in their own colorless oblivion. In the distance, the three heads of Cerberus rose above the teeming masses, the great hound letting out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in Percy's bones. The beast had sensed him, an anomaly, a living soul in the land of the dead. Percy met the gaze of the central head. He didn't brandish a weapon or offer a soprano ball. He simply let a sliver of his true nature show. He allowed the cold, predatory authority of the vampire lord to bleed into his aura. He was a creature of darkness, an eater of life essence. A king of a lightless, benthic realm. He was, in his own way, a child of the underworld's aesthetic. Cerberus's growl faltered, turning into a confused whine. The beast tilted its massive heads, sensing not a threat to be devoured, but a kindred power to be acknowledged. With a final, huffing snort, the great hound lay back down, resting its chins on its massive paws, and watched him with a newfound, wary respect. Percy walked through the fields, the listless shades parting before him like mist. He was a point of sharp, cold focus in a world of diffused apathy. He bypassed the judgment pavilion and the long, winding paths, instead simply stepping from one deep shadow to the next, covering leagues with each silent stride. He was a ghost in a land of ghosts, and he had never felt more comfortable in his own skin. He arrived at the gates of the palace of Hades, two immense slabs of obsidian decorated with the tormented faces of the damned. The skeletal guards, clad in Stygian iron, raised their pikes, but a single, cold look from Percy was enough to make them pause. A moment later, the gates swung inward with a groan that sounded like a dying world. He had been expected. The throne room was a cavern of breathtaking, morbid grandeur. The floor was polished obsidian, reflecting the ghostly green light of the braziers. The walls were veined with silver and gold, not as decoration, but as raw, untamed veins of wealth. At the far end of the hall, two thrones sat side by side. One, carved from the fused bones of forgotten monsters, was empty. The other, woven from impossible, living flowers that bloomed in shades of black, purple, and blood red, was occupied. Persephone, queen of the underworld, regarded his approach with an expression of cool, detached curiosity. Her beauty was as sharp and dangerous as a shard of ice. Hades was not on his throne. Percy found him to the side of the hall, observing a private, recessed chamber where great sinners performed their eternal labors. Sisyphus, his muscles straining, heaved his boulder up a hill of skulls. Tantalus stood in a pool of water that receded from his grasping fingers. Hades watched them with the quiet, focused satisfaction of a master craftsman admiring his work. "Perseus Jackson," Hades said without turning. His voice was soft, yet it filled the vast hall. It was the sound of earth settling in a fresh grave. "You have made a mess of the established order. I find it refreshing." "I'm not here for a performance review," Percy replied, stopping a respectful distance away. He gave a slight, formal nod to Persephone, who acknowledged it with the barest incline of her head. Hades finally turned. He was not the monstrous, fiery demon mortals imagined. He was tall and regal, with skin as pale as marble and eyes as dark and deep as the pits of Tartarus. He wore robes of black silk so fine they seemed to be woven from captured souls. "No," the god agreed. "You are here for a business proposition." He gestured for Percy to walk with him, moving towards the center of the hall. "My brothers are fools. Zeus is a paranoid tyrant who sees a challenge to his throne in every falling leaf. Poseidon is a tempest of emotion, powerful but ultimately reactive. They see your transformation as an insurrection to be crushed." He paused, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "I see it as an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Percy asked, his guard up. This was a game of words, a field of battle where his new powers meant little. "For a realignment of celestial politics," Hades said smoothly. "But that is a long and tedious game. For you, the opportunity is more immediate: survival. You have an enemy you do not yet comprehend. An enemy that threatens us all." "The sun scorched," Percy stated. It wasn't a question. Hades's eyes gleamed with faint surprise. "So you have met them. Good. That simplifies matters. You think they are just monsters. They are not. They are the vanguard of an ideology, a crusade. They serve a king from a forgotten pantheon, a being who believes that the very existence of demigods, of nature spirits, of a thing that blurs the line between divine and mortal, is a cosmic stain that must be burned away. They don't distinguish between the sky, the sea, or the soil. To them, we are all just weeds in their garden." The god stopped, his dark eyes boring into Percy. "And you, son of Poseidon, who now walks as a lord of night, you are the ultimate heresy. You are their primary target." Percy remained silent, absorbing the information. It confirmed the feeling he'd had, the sense of fanatical purpose behind the attacks. "This is where our interests align," Hades continued. "I do not wish for my king, Dom, to be incinerated by some self-righteous, forgotten deity. And you do not wish to be extinguished. I have information. You have a unique talent for dealing with such things. And more importantly, you are unburdened by the rules and protocols that hamstring Olympus." "What information?" Percy asked. "Your recent disagreement with my nephew Apollo was not entirely his own idea," Hades said, enjoying the revelation. "Nor was the faulty intelligence on the quest that cost the life of your friend, Lee Fletcher. There is a faction on Olympus, led by a very clever and very patient god, that is using you. They are nudging events, creating chaos, using your predictable reactions to weaken Zeus's authority and create instability. They see you as a convenient crowbar to pry open the cracks in the foundation of the world." Percy's blood ran cold. The grief for Lee, which had settled into a hard, cold knot in his chest, flared with a fresh, sharp pain. It wasn't just incompetence. It was deliberate, malicious. He had been a pawn in more ways than one. "Who?" Percy's voice was a low growl. "Patience," Hades chided gently. "That is a card I will hold for now. What I will give you is a more immediate target. The sun-scorched are not fighting with sticks and stones. They are arming themselves. They have established a forge, a place where they are crafting weapons from a materia I have not seen since the dawn of the world. Weapons designed not to banish, but to permanently unmake divine beings. Gods, titans, demigods, vampires." He produced a shard of twisted, obsidian-like metal from a fold in his robes. It looked like the material from the creature in the alley. It radiated a faint, sickening heat. I will give you the location of this forge, Hades said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You will go there. You will destroy it. You will disrupt their supply chain and buy us all some time. And in return, Percy asked, knowing the price was coming. A favor, Hades said simply. To be rendered at a time of my choosing. A service for the house of Hades. Percy looked at the god, then at the shard of metal. The offer was a poisoned apple, a deal with the devil. But it was also the only real lead he had. He was tired of being a pawn. It was time to start moving the pieces himself. The terms are unacceptable, Percy stated. Hades raised an eyebrow. Persephone, on her throne, leaned forward ever so slightly. I am not your errand boy, Percy continued, his voice steady and cold. I will accept your information, as it aligns with my own goals. And in the future, if you require a service that also aligns with my goals, I will consider it. But I will not be bound by a blank check. I am a sovereign power, not your asset. My favor is not something you can purchase. It was an audacious, almost suicidal, counter-offer. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the green flames in the braziers. Hades stared at Percy, a god of immense, ancient power being dictated terms by a boy who was barely 2 decades old. Then, to Percy's surprise, Hades let out a soft, dry chuckle. It was the sound of shifting bones. Audacious, the god murmured, a gleam of genuine amusement in his dark eyes. Poseidon's boy has teeth. Very well. A pact of mutual interest, then, between the Lord of the Underworld and the Crimson Sage of the Tides. I accept your terms. He was bestowing a title, acknowledging Percy's status. It was a subtle but significant concession. The forge is hidden within a dormant volcano known to mortals as Mount Taylor, in New Mexico. Hades said, a place where the fires of the earth once burned hot. They have rekindled them for their own dark purposes. Be warned, it will be heavily guarded. He tossed the shard of hot metal to Percy, who caught it effortlessly. It felt wrong in his hand, a piece of solidified hatred. A final piece of advice, Hades said, his voice becoming serious again. Do not trust any of them. Especially the ones who smile the most. Percy nodded. Thank you for the information. He didn't say, Your Majesty, or, Lord Hades. They were equals in this transaction. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, he said, looking back at the god. My mother, Sally Jackson, she is to be considered under my protection. Any harm that comes to her, from any source, divine or otherwise, I will consider a personal matter. It was a quiet, deadly serious warning. Hades met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Understood. The queen of my brother's heart has always been off limits. Your concern has been noted. With that, Percy stepped back into the deepest shadow in the throne room and was gone, leaving a faint chill in the air where he had stood. Hone rose from her throne and glided to her husband's side. You may have just armed a power you will not be able to control, she said, her voice like the rustle of poisonous flowers. He is not like the others. Hades watched the shadow where Percy had vanished, a thoughtful, calculating expression on his face. That, my dear, is precisely why he is so valuable, he replied. The world is a chessboard. And for millennia the pieces have been the same. A new queen has just entered the game. Let's see who he chooses to checkmate. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. The Sun-Scorched Forge. Finding Nick D'Angelo was like trying to find a specific shadow in a room full of them. For anyone else, it would have been impossible. For Percy, it was a matter of tuning his senses. He didn't search for a person, he searched for a resonance. A specific frequency of darkness and melancholy that was uniquely Nico's. He found him in a quiet, forgotten cemetery in New Orleans, sitting on a crumbling mausoleum, having a silent conversation with the ghosts that lingered there. Percy didn't announce his arrival. He simply stepped out of the tomb's long shadow, the shard of sun-scorched metal from Hades held loosely in his hand. Nico didn't flinch, he just looked up, his dark eyes taking in Percy's changed appearance. The ghosts around him dissipated like smoke in a breeze, recoiling from Percy's formidable aura. Jackson, Nico said, his voice as soft as grave dust. You look different. I feel different, Percy replied, getting straight to the point. I need your help. I heard what happened at camp, Nico said, ignoring the request for a moment. The Chimera, your declaration. Some are calling you a traitor. Others are terrified. Which is it? Neither, Percy said. I'm a pragmatist. He tossed the shard of metal to Nico. Nico caught it, and his eyes widened as his hand closed around it. He dropped it instantly with a hiss, as if it had burned him. The shard fell to the grass, It withered and turned black where it touched. What in my father's name is that? He breathed, staring at the object. It feels wrong, like a scream made of metal. It's a weapon, Percy explained. Made to permanently kill things like us. Things like our fathers. There's a forge in New Mexico, churning them out. I'm going to destroy it. Nico looked from the shard back to Percy, his gaze analytical. He saw the cold resolve in Percy's eyes, the absence of the reckless boy he used to be. He saw a commander. Who's on the team? So far, you and me. Nico nodded slowly, a decision already made. He had spent his life navigating the shadows, dealing with the ugly truths the campers preferred to ignore. This was just another truth, another shadow. The children of the Big Three, together again. It has a certain grim poetry to it. I'm in, but you'll need more than just darkness and brute force for an infiltration. I know, Percy said. That's our next stop. Annabeth was where RCY knew she would be. In the library at Camp Half-Blood, surrounded by scrolls and architectural diagrams. She was trying to solve the problem of him, trying to find a historical or mythological precedent for what he had become. Trying to strategize a way to bring her friend back from a brink she didn't understand. When he stepped through an unlit corner of the library, bypassing the camp's magical borders as if they weren't there. Her hand flew to the dagger at her belt. Her gray eyes were filled with a turbulent mix of anger, fear, and a deep, painful longing. You can't just keep doing that, she said, her voice tight. It's the most efficient way to travel, Percy replied, his tone even. He stopped across the large oak table from her, creating a deliberate barrier between them. I'm not here to argue, Annabeth. I'm here to recruit you. Recruit me, she scoffed, though there was no heat in it. For what? Your one-man kingdom in the sea? No, thank you. For a mission that is vital to the survival of this camp. And every other demigod on this continent, he said. He slid the sun-scorched shard across the polished wood. It left a faint, smoky trail in its wake. She stared at it, her strategist's mind immediately recognizing the alien craftsmanship, the inherent wrongness of the material. What is it? A key, Percy said. To a war you don't even know you're fighting yet. An enemy is rising, one that wants to exterminate us all. Not for power, not for territory, but out of pure, fanatical ideology. They're building an arsenal in a dormant volcano in New Mexico. I'm going to destroy it. Nico is in. I need you. I need your mind, Annabeth. I can fight, but you can see the battlefield. You can find the cracks in the fortress wall before we even get there. He was appealing to her core identity. The strategist, the architect, the protector. He wasn't asking for her loyalty to him, but to their shared world. It was a masterfully calculated move. She looked from the shard to his face. Her expression tormented. Why should I trust you, Percy? Look at what you've become. You're cold. You're ruthless. The way you dealt with those monsters, that wasn't you. It's the version of me that's going to keep us alive, he said, his voice softening for the first time. The old me got Lee Fletcher killed. This me will not make the same mistake. I need you, wise girl. Not as a friend, not as anything else. I need you as a soldier. And you need me to face what's coming. She stared at him for a long, silent minute, a war raging in her gray eyes. Then, with a deep, resigned sigh, she pushed the shard back towards him. Brief me on the way. And if you try anything that puts innocent lives at risk, I will put you down myself. I'd expect nothing less, Percy said. And for the first time, a flicker of a genuine, ghost of a smile touched his lips. The air over Mount Taylor was thin and bitingly hot. The desert landscape was a panorama of scorched earth and hardy, twisted scrub. A world of harsh light and stark shadows that was the antithesis of Percy's new nature. He felt the sun on his skin like a physical weight, a constant, draining pressure. The three of them crouched behind a rock outcropping, looking down at the base of the dormant volcano. To a mortal, it would look like an abandoned mining operation. Rusted fences, dilapidated shacks, a wide, dark tunnel leading into the mountain. To their demigod senses, it was a fortress. Percy could feel the rhythmic, disciplined heartbeats of at least 24 guards. Annabeth could see the subtle, interlocking fields of magic that formed a perimeter defense, designed to alert them to any divine or monstrous energy. Nico could feel the tortured, angry spirits of the mountain itself, twisted into unwilling watchdogs. Standard assault is a suicide run, Annabeth murmured, her eyes scanning every detail. The defenses are layered. We'd be overwhelmed before we got 100 feet. We're not doing a standard assault, Percy said. He turned to Nico. Can you feel them? The guards. Nico closed his eyes. They're demigods. Or they were. Their souls feel scoured, burned clean of everything but loyalty. It's unnatural. Hand signals from here on out, Percy commanded softly. Annabeth, find us a blind spot. Nico, stay with me. We move through the shadows. No contact unless absolutely necessary. Priority is the forge. Annabeth pointed to a section of the rock face a quarter-mile to the north. There, the geothermal vents. The energy signature from them is chaotic. It should mask our approach if we're careful. Percy nodded. He gave a series of sharp, precise gestures, a combat language that felt as natural to him as speech. Flanking pattern. I take point. You two cover. Move. They became ghosts. Percy used his control over darkness to literally bend the shadows around them, creating a moving patch of night that slid across the sun-baked rock. They moved with a silence that was absolute. When they came upon a two-man patrol, demigods in black, heat-resistant armor, their faces grim and their eyes glowing with a faint, zealous light, Percy didn't hesitate. He gestured to Nico, who nodded. Both of them dissolved into the shadow of a large boulder. The guards walked past, their boots crunching on the gravel. As they passed, two tendrils of solid darkness erupted from the boulder's shadow. One wrapped around each guard's throat, silencing them and lifting them off the ground. There was a brief, muffled struggle, then a sharp, final snap. The bodies were dragged back into the shadow, which consumed them without a trace. It was silent, brutal, and chillingly efficient. Annabeth, watching from her cover, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't a battle, it was an assassination. They reached the tunnel entrance Annabeth had identified. The heat pouring out was like a physical blow. Percy held up a hand, signaling a halt. He closed his eyes, extending his vampiric senses into the mountain. He felt the vibrations, the rhythmic clang of hammers, the low hum of immense power. And beneath it all, a faint, agonizing pulse of life. A prisoner. He turned to his team. His eyes grim, heavy resistance. One central chamber. A powerful energy source, captive. That's our target. He looked at Annabeth. Find me a way to break it. He looked at Nico. You and I will create the diversion. They entered the volcano. The tunnel sloped down into the earth, the air growing hotter and thicker with every step. The walls glowed with a faint, hellish red light. The tunnel opened into a vast, hemispherical cavern, the heart of the dormant volcano. The sight was something out of a nightmare. In the center of the cavern, suspended in a cage of crackling Stygian iron, was a young woman made of pure, gentle sunlight. A Heliod. She was weeping tears of fire, and her light was being siphoned off through a series of obsidian conduits into a massive, central forge. Around the forge, dozens of the sun-scorched soldiers worked with grim purpose, hammering out glowing hot blades of the foul, anti-divine metal on anvils of cooled lava. Overseeing the operation from a raised platform was the forge master. He was a giant of a man, a demigod who must have been a son of Hephaestus, given his massive, muscular frame. His face was a roadmap of scars, and his eyes burned with the same zealous light as his soldiers, but brighter, hotter. He wielded a massive warhammer that glowed with a sickening, internal heat. Annabeth's breath caught in her throat. By the gods, she whispered. Percy touched her arm. The conduits, he gestured. Overload them. She nodded, her eyes already tracing the flow of power, formulating a dozen different sabotage plans. Nico, Percy signaled, cause chaos. Draw their attention. On my mark. Nico grinned, a rare, wolfish expression. He pressed his hands to the stone floor and closed his eyes. Percy focused on the forge master, who seemed to sense a disturbance, his head tilting. Now, Percy projected into their minds. Nico's power exploded outwards. The ground of the cavern cracked, and a dozen skeletal warriors, ancient spirits of the mountain roused and enraged by Nico's call, clawed their way out of the rock. They charged the sun scorched with silent, bony screams, creating the perfect diversion. In the same instant, Annabeth sprinted from cover, moving with a grace and speed Percy hadn't seen before, her dagger flashing as she began to slash at the junctions and power regulators on the conduits, a blur of strategic destruction. The cavern erupted into chaos. The sun-scorched soldiers engaged the skeletons, their hot, dark weapons shattering the undead warriors, who simply reformed from the rock a moment later. The Forge Master roared in fury, his eyes scanning the chaos and immediately locking onto the true threat, Annabeth. He leapt from his platform, his warhammer raised, aiming to cruise her before she could complete her work. But Percy was already there. He intercepted the Forge Master in midair, a silent, dark blur. He didn't use a weapon. He simply slammed into the larger demigod with the force of a freight train, his vampiric strength throwing them both across the cavern and away from Annabeth. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The Forge Master was the first to rise, his sheer size giving him the advantage. "The abomination," he roared, his voice like an avalanche. "Lord Lycurgus foretold your coming. I will have the honor of purifying your corrupted soul." He swung his hammer in a devastating arc that should have pulverized Percy. But Percy flowed backwards, the hammer missing by a hair's breadth, the heat from it scorching his face. He created two shadow clones of himself, which instantly flanked the Forge Master, darting in with attacks from both sides. The Forge Master laughed, a booming, contemptuous sound. He swung his hammer in a circle, the wave of pure divine heat instantly dissolving the shadow clones. Tricks and whispers. The tools of the dark. Face me with honor. Honor is a luxury for a battle you can afford to lose, Percy said, his voice cold. He abandoned the shinobi tactics. They weren't working against this zealot's raw power. It was time for the predator to emerge. He shot forward, his speed an unnatural blur. He slammed a palm against the Forge Master's chest. A wave of intense cold spread from the point of impact, covering the demigod's armor in a layer of black frost. The Forge Master grunted in pain, the cold leeching his strength. But the internal fire of his fanaticism burned it away in a second. He backhanded Percy, the blow sending him skidding across the obsidian floor. Percy landed in a crouch, a trickle of dark blood running from his lip. The Forge Master was strong. Stronger than he'd anticipated, and his hammer, made of that foul metal, was a direct threat. He needed to end this. Meanwhile, Annabeth had reached the primary regulator at the base of the Heliad's cage. It was a complex mess of interlocking runes and magical circuits. A puzzle she was born to solve. Nico held the line, his skeleton army keeping the soldiers occupied, but they were beginning to falter, their numbers dwindling. Percy rose to his feet. He spat the blood from his mouth onto the floor. Then, his eyes locked on the crimson droplet. He raised his hand, and the drop of blood rose with it. It began to spin, faster and faster, until it was a tiny, whirring disk. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he shot it forward. It was not a drop of liquid. It was a razor-sharp, crystalline shuriken of his own hardened essence. It flew faster than an arrow, striking the Forge Master in the unarmored gap at his elbow. The demigod roared in pain, a deep gash opening in his arm. Percy didn't give him a moment to recover. He summoned the moisture from the hot, humid air, forming dozens of needle-sharp icicles that he sent hurtling towards his opponent. The Forge Master shattered them with a swing of his hammer, but it was a distraction. Percy was already behind him, his hands wreathed in shadows. "It's over," Percy said. "Surrender. Tell me where the other forges are." "There are no others." The Forge Master spat, turning to swing his hammer. "There is only the cleansing fire of Lord Lycurgus. And you will be its kindling." His swing was wild, desperate. Percy ducked under it, close, inside the giant's guard. He placed his hand on the Forge Master's chest again. But this time, he didn't use cold. He used the core ability of the Vampire Lord. He began to pull. The Forge Master's eyes widened in horror. He felt his life force, his divine energy, his very soul being ripped from him, siphoned into the demigod before him. His muscles locked up, His strength fled. His zealous fire was being consumed by a cold, insatiable void. What are you? He choked out, his massive body trembling. I'm your heresy, Percy whispered back. It's done, Annabeth yelled. She slammed her dagger into the final rune sequence. The entire cavern shuddered. The obsidian conduits leading from the Heliad's cage began to glow an angry, unstable red. The containment field was about to fail. The captured sun nymph looked down at Percy, her fiery eyes filled not with fear, but with gratitude. She gave a single, radiant nod. Percy knew what was about to happen. He drained the last of the Forge Master's essence, the giant demigod crumbling into a pile of armor and dust. He grabbed Nico and Annabeth. Hold on, he yelled, and enveloped them all in the deepest shadow he could summon, a protective sphere of absolute night. The Heliad's cage shattered. The sun nymph was free. With a joyful, triumphant cry, she unleashed a nova of pure, unadulterated sunlight. It wasn't an attack, it was a release, a cleansing. The entire cavern was filled with a light so bright, so pure, it was absolute. The Ning's sun-scorched soldiers and their foul weapons were vaporized instantly, their corrupted nature unable to exist in the face of such purity. The forge melted. The anvils turned to slag. The very rock of the volcano began to liquefy. The blast washed over Percy's sphere of shadow, which held for a tense, vibrating moment before dissipating. When the light faded, the three of them stood in a cavern that had been scoured clean, now rapidly filling with magma. The Heliod was gone, her essence expended in her final, glorious release. We have to go, now, Annabeth yelled over the roar of the collapsing mountain. Nico grabbed their hands and shadow traveled them out, collapsing onto the desert sand a mile away just as Mount Taylor erupted behind them, a plume of smoke and ash and purified light reaching for the heavens. They lay there for a long moment, breathing heavily, watching their handiwork. They had won. They had destroyed the forge. Then, Nico sat up, his face pale. As I was pulling us out, he said, his voice grim, I felt the soul of the Forge Master passing. He screamed a final thought. Not a curse, a report. Nico looked at Percy, his dark eyes full of dread. He said, Forge Alpha has fallen. Alert the network. The Beta and Gamma sites must accelerate production. The victory turned to ash in their mouths. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was just the first bloody skirmish in a war they were already losing. Annabeth looked at Percy, at the cold, determined set of his jaw, and knew that the boy she had once known was well and truly gone. In his place was the general this new, terrifying war demanded. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 8. The Price of Power. The air on the Hoover Dam's maintenance platform was no longer just hot, it was thick with the residue of a god's presence and the heavier weight of an impossible choice. Lycurgus's ideological assault had shattered the Conclave's fragile neutrality. He hadn't declared war with a sword, but with a sermon. And it had been devastatingly effective. The demigods and hunters were no longer just arguing about jurisdiction, they were confronting a crisis of faith in their own existence. They retreated to a secure, windowless control room deep within the dam's concrete heart, a neutral space offered by a bewildered but intimidated mortal engineer after a brief, forceful display of the mist by Percy. The room was cold, sterile, and smelled of ozone and old machinery, a perfect crucible for the forging of their desperate alliance. Reyna paced the length of the room, her purple cloak a slash of color against the drab gray walls. His words, they were poison, she said, her voice tight with a frustration that was alien to her usually stoic demeanor. He offers order, purity, to a Roman. Those are not just words. They are the pillars of our civilization. Some of my legionnaires, they would be swayed by that promise. He's offering genocide and calling it salvation, Talia countered. Leaning against a large turbine diagram, her arms crossed. Aegis crackled softly, mirroring her agitation. But she's right. His charisma is a weapon in itself. Some of my younger hunters, the ones who came to us from broken homes, seeking a clear purpose, the idea of a pure world, free of the chaos of men and gods, might be a siren song. The alliance was fracturing before it had even formed. Percy stood over a large steel table in the center of the room, his silence a heavy counterpoint to their anxious debate. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at his own hands. Seeing not a demigod's strength or a vampire's power, but the impossible weight of the decision that now rested upon them. Annabeth acted as the bridge. "This is his strategy," she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "He divides us with philosophy before he even draws a blade. He wants us to question our own worth, because an army that doesn't believe in its own right to exist has already lost." She looked at Percy, a silent question in her eyes. "Led them." Now, Percy finally looked up, and the effect was instantaneous. The anxious chatter died. His crimson-flecked eyes were not fiery with passion or cold with despair. They were utterly, chillingly clear. "He calls us a disease," Percy said, his voice low and steady, yet it commanded the room. "Fine, let's be the fever that burns him out of the system." He unrolled Annabeth's schematic of the forge on the table. "He has at least 2 more of these. Beta and Gamma. They are his priority. That means they are our priority. We are no longer debating if we act. We are deciding how. Reyna, your legion has experience with large-scale fortifications. I need you and Frank to analyze this layout. Find the structural weaknesses common to all 3. Talia, your hunters are the best trackers in the world. I need you to find the supply lines. They're transporting that metal, they're moving personnel. They have a logistics trail. Find it." He wasn't asking. He was assigning. He was treating them not as rival leaders to be persuaded, but as commanders of specialized divisions in his army. It was audacious, arrogant, and precisely the kind of decisive leadership the moment demanded. Reyna and Talia bristled, but they also listened. He was giving them a tangible mission, a way to fight back against the existential dread Lycurgus had instilled. It was in that moment of fragile, burgeoning unity that the first blow fell. A shimmering, rainbow-hued window opened in the air next to Percy. An iris message, but it was unstable, flickering and distorted. A sign of a desperate, panicked call. The face of Grover Underwood, his goat-like features contorted in terror, appeared in the frame. The background was a scene of utter chaos, smoke, splintered wood, and the unmistakable floral pattern of the wallpaper from Sally Jackson's living room. "Percy," Grover bleated, his voice tinny and breaking up. "They're here. Monsters. Not the normal kind. They came out of nowhere. We've got mortals screaming. The mist is shredding. Your mom, Percy, you have too." The message cut out, the rainbow dissolving into the conditioned air, leaving behind a silence more profound than a scream. Percy froze, his entire body going rigid. The cool, commanding presence vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. "Mom." And then the second blow fell. A masterpiece of cruel, calculated timing. Nico D'Angelo, who had been standing silently in the corner, suddenly staggered, his hand flying to his temple. A low groan escaped his lips. "Father," he gasped, his eyes wide with a pain that wasn't his own. A column of black, swirling shadow erupted from the floor in front of Nico. It was not a shadow travel portal. It was a message, a direct communique from the Lord of the Dead. Within the swirling darkness, a vision took shape. It showed a windswept, desolate plateau of red rock under a sky of bruised purple. The Garden of the Gods. In the center of the plateau, a circle of sun-scorched zealots chanted in a guttural, ancient language. They stood around a bound figure, a powerful, ancient dryad, her tree 4M body writhing in agony as her essence was being twisted and corrupted. They were not just killing her. They were using her as a focus, a living sacrifice to fundamentally rewrite the nature of the earth she was bound to. As they watched, the ground within their circle began to change. The red rock turned a sickly, pale white, and the air above it shimmered with a golden, purifying heat. A well of purity, Hades's voice echoed from the vision, cold and grim. They are creating a permanent beachhead. A sanctuary where Lycurgus's power will be absolute, and from which he can draw immense strength. They complete the ritual at midnight. My sources tell me this is their beta site. Not a forge, but something far worse. The vision of the ritual faded, leaving the black shadow to collapse in on itself. Percy stood between the ghost of his friend's desperate plea and the specter of a major strategic catastrophe. New York City, where his mother was under attack. Colorado Springs, where the enemy was carving out a piece of the world for their king. He looked at the clock on the control room wall. It was just after 6 p.m. He had less than 6 hours. The locations were over 1,700 miles apart. He could not be in two places at once. The trap was perfect. The choice was impossible. His newfound allies stared at him, their own debates forgotten, their faces reflecting the horror of his dilemma. They saw it all laid bare, the personal against the strategic. The heart against the mind. It's a feint, Reyna said, her voice hard but not unkind. The attack in New York is a distraction, Percy. A classic pincer movement. They are using your emotional attachment to draw you away from the true strategic threat. The praetor is right, Talia added, her expression grim. We have to stop that ritual. If they create a place where their god is all-powerful, we've lost the war before it's even begun. They were correct. Their logic was cold, brutal, and undeniable. Annabeth looked at Percy, her face pale, her gray eyes swirling with a terrible conflict. She knew they were right. But she also knew the look on Percy's face. She knew the bond he shared with his mother, a bond that had been forged in the fire of a dozen quests and 100 monster attacks. To ask him to abandon Sally was to ask him to cut out his own heart. Percy was silent for a long, agonizing moment. The commander who had so coolly taken charge just minutes before was gone. In his place was a son, trapped in a nightmare. He looked at their faces, at their logical, strategic arguments, and he felt a surge of something cold and clear, a fury that burned away the panic. It was the fury of a king whose family had been threatened. You're both right, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. It's a trap, it's a strategic imperative, and we're not going to choose. He looked up, and the full, terrifying force of his will returned, no longer just the mind of a general, but the heart of a predator. We're going to do both. He turned to Reyna and Frank. Praetor, the well in Colorado is an affront to the very idea of Roman order. I am not ordering you. I am asking you, take the legion, not to stop the ritual. You can't, but to delay it, to disrupt it. Buy me time. That is a battle of discipline and fortitude. No one is better suited for it than the 12th Legion Fulminata. He met Reyna's eyes, a plea and a command intertwined. Hold the line. Reyna stared at him, her mind reeling. He was giving her a command, but framing it in a way that honored Roman strength. He was trusting her with the most vital strategic task. A slow, decisive nod was her answer. We will hold it, she said. Percy then turned to Talia. That attack on my mother was not random. They had her location. They bypassed wards. They had help. I need you in New York, Lieutenant. Not at the apartment. You and your hunters are the best scouts in the world. I want you to be my eyes. Find the source. Find out who directed them. Hunt the one pulling the strings. Talia's silver eyes flashed with understanding. A hunt. A clear, deadly purpose. Consider it done, she said, her voice tight with anticipation. Finally, he looked at Annabeth and Nico. The trap is for me, he said. So I'm going to walk into it. But I'm not going in alone. His gaze rested on Annabeth, a universe of unspoken fear and trust passing between them in a single glance. I need you with me. I'll be compromised. I need you to be the strategist. Nico, I need your shadows. We're going to hit them so hard and so fast they won't know what happened. No one argued. The plan was born of desperation, a frantic gamble against impossible odds, but it was a plan. He had taken an impossible choice and forged it into a weapon. A multi-pronged assault that utilized the unique strengths of every person in the room. In that moment, he wasn't just a demigod or a vampire. He was the leader of their new, fragile world. The scene, in Sally Jackson's Upper East Side neighborhood was a pocket of localized hell. The mortal world was trying, and failing, to comprehend the chaos. A gas main had apparently exploded, the official story already being woven by the struggling threads of the mist. Police cars and fire trucks formed a perimeter, their flashing lights painting the smoke-filled street in strobing shades of red and blue. For Percy, Annabeth, and Nico, the reality was far worse. Percy felt the life auras. A dozen powerful, unnatural monsters, and one faint, flickering, terrified human light on the 5th floor. His mother. What are they? Annabeth breathed, crouching behind a fire truck, her eyes wide as she took in the creatures scaling the walls of the apartment building. They were chimeras, but twisted, nightmarish amalgamations. A wolf with the wings of a bat and a scorpion's tail. A bear with skin made of writhing snakes. They were abominations of divine biology, creatures that screamed of unnatural creation. The work of a god with too much time and not enough morals, Percy growled, his hands clenching. He could feel the rage building, a cold, predatory fire. Hermes, god of innovation, we can't fight them all on the street, Annabeth said, her mind already working. We go through the underworld. Nico nodded, his face grim. The subway tunnels. There's an old, forgotten entrance to the underworld 2 blocks from here. We can come up through the building's foundation. They moved like wraiths through the chaos, slipping into the shadows of an alley. Nico pressed his hand to a brick wall, which dissolved into a yawning, dark passage. They plunged into the cold, musty darkness of the underworld's back alleys. They emerged minutes later in the building's basement, the screams and sounds of destruction from above echoing through the concrete. They stormed the building, a trinity of vengeance. Annabeth led the way, her dagger a blur, her shield deflecting attacks, her voice calling out structural weaknesses and enemy positions. Nico became a phantom, raising the angry spirits of those who had died in the old tenement building, a ghostly army that swarmed the monstrous chimeras, distracting and confusing them. Percy was death itself. He didn't use tricks or strategy. He flowed through the chaos, a river of focused, cold rage. He met a serpent bear in the 3rd-floor hallway. It breathed a cloud of venomous snakes at him. Percy simply froze them in midair with a wave of absolute cold, then shattered them into dust. He moved past the creature, his hand lashing out and touching its side. The monster's life force was siphoned out in a single, silent scream, its body collapsing into a pile of desiccated scales and fur. He was a force of nature, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. He reached the 5th floor. The door to his mother's apartment was splintered, hanging off its hinges. Inside, the place he had grown up, the only true home he had ever known, was a ruin. Furniture was overturned, books torn, and the smell of his mother's blue cookies was buried under the stench of monster. Sally Jackson stood in the center of the wreckage, her face pale but defiant. Wielding a bronze-tipped spear Percy hadn't seen before. Paul Blofus stood beside her, bravely holding a simple baseball bat. They were cornered by the squad's leader, a tall, gaunt my god with the fanatical eyes of a true believer. Your son is an abomination, mortal. The demigod snarled at Sally. He will be cleansed, and the world will be purified of his taint. The only thing that needs cleansing here is your mouth, dear, Sally shot back, her voice shaking but full of steel. Then Percy was there. He didn't make an entrance. One moment the demigod was threatening his mother. The next Percy was standing behind him, his hand on the zealot's shoulder, a grip like a block of frozen iron. You made a mistake. Percy's voice was barely a whisper, but it was colder than the grave. The zealot spun around, his face contorting in a mask of ecstatic fury. The abomination. You are too late. The well of purity is nearly complete. Our benefactor assured us you would be occupied. Your benefactor is a dead man walking, Percy said. He didn't want to fight. He wanted answers. He released his grip on the demigod's shoulder and instead pressed the palm of his hand to the man's forehead. He didn't pull life force. He pushed. He pushed his own consciousness, his vampiric will, directly into the demigod's mind. It was a brutal, intimate violation. He tore through the zealot's memories, his pathetic hopes, his fanatical beliefs. He saw the face of Lycurgus, a being of blinding, beautiful light. And then he found it. The memory of the meeting. The benefactor who had given them the location. The one who had arranged their transport. The memory was hazy, shrouded in divine power, but one image was perfectly clear, a symbol burned into the zealot's mind. A pair of entwined snakes around a winged staff. The caduceus, Hermes. Percy ripped his mind back out, leaving the demigod a whimpering, catatonic wreck on the floor. He had his proof. Percy. His mother cried, rushing to him. He caught her in a hug, the cold rage momentarily receding, replaced by a wave of desperate, aching relief. He was not too late. Just then, his earpiece, a small, mist-shrouded device Annabeth had rigged, crackled to life. It was Raina's voice, strained and breathless, the sounds of battle raging behind her. Jackson, we've held them. They're pouring everything they have into the final ritual. We've taken heavy casualties. We can't hold them much longer. Whatever you're going to do, you have to do it now. The choice was back. The impossible, Terrible choice. He had saved his mother. But the price was being paid, right now, in blood, by the Romans in Colorado. He pulled back from his mother's embrace. He looked at Annabeth, his eyes full of a pain she had never seen before. The weight of command, of his choices, was crashing down on him. He had won here, but his victory was about to cost Reyna and her legion everything. He met Annabeth's gaze, and in that silent, desperate moment, their bond was forged into something unbreakable. She saw not the monster, not the king, but the hero, trapped and forced to pay a price no one should have to pay. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip firm, a silent promise. You are not alone in this. He had saved his family. But the war had just begun, and the first bill had come due. Chapter 8 End. Chapter 9. War of the Pantheons. The relief of his mother's safety was a fleeting, sun-warmed current in a vast, Arctic ocean of dread. Reyna's voice, strained and cracking over the comms, was a testament to the brutal cost of his choice. He had saved one life he cherished, but the lives of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Roman legionnaires were now being spent like cheap coin in the mountains of Colorado. The weight of it was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that threatened to splinter his cold, newfound resolve. I have to go, he said, his voice raw. He pulled away from his mother, the warmth of her hug already a fading memory. He looked at Annabeth, a silent, desperate question in his eyes. He had made the emotional choice, now he had to live with the strategic consequences. Annabeth didn't hesitate. Her face was a mask of focused intensity, the strategist taking control when the king was faltering. Go, she said, her voice firm. Nico and I will secure your mother. We'll get her and Paul to the only place that's truly safe right now, the underworld. Your father's kingdom is in turmoil, and Olympus is a snake pit. But Hades has a vested interest in your success. He'll keep her safe. Nico nodded, his expression grim. My father honors bargains, and he enjoys having leverage. She will be an honored, and heavily guarded, guest. It was a bitter pill, sending his moth to the land of the dead for protection, but it was the only logical move. Percy gave Sally one last, hard look, a silent promise of his return, then turned. Nico, get me there. Now. He didn't wait for an answer. He plunged the apartment into an absolute, disorienting darkness, a shadow deep enough for Nico to use as a gateway. The world dissolved into a sickening, cold rush, and an instant later, he was spit out of the shadow of a monolithic red rock on the plains of Colorado. The scene was a portrait from a forgotten, brutal age. The sun had set, but the battlefield was illuminated by a sickly, golden glow emanating from the center of the plateau, where the ritual to create the well of purity was nearing its terrible climax. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, blood, and the coppery tang of incinerated monster dust. The 12th Legion Fulminata was not just holding the line, they were dying on it. They had formed the testudo, the classic turtle formation, a wall of interlocking golden shields. But the enemy was not a barbarian horde. Lycurgus's army, clad in their black, heat-resistant armor, moved with a terrifying, coordinated grace. They wielded not just the dark, divine killing blades, but lances that hurled bolts of the same pure, golden energy that powered the ritual. Each bolt that struck the Roman shields didn't just dent or break them, it unmade them, dissolving the imperial gold into motes of harmless light. A gap would appear in the line, and the sun-scorched would surge forward, their blades a blur, before the legionnaires could close ranks. It was a battle of attrition, and Rome was losing. Percy saw Frank Jong, in his full praetor's armor, shifting forms in the heart of the battle. He became a massive grizzly bear, swiping at the zealots, then a war elephant, trampling a squad underfoot, his roars of rage and grief echoing across the plateau. But for every enemy he took down, two more took its place. He was a force of nature, but even nature could be eroded. On a small rise, directing the defense, stood Reyna. Her face was streaked with grime and blood, her purple cloak torn, but her eyes were still burning with the indomitable fire of Rome. She moved with a sharp, economic grace, her blade a silver blur, pointing out weaknesses, shouting commands, her voice a beacon of order in the chaos. Her two metallic greyhounds, Aurum and Argentum, fought at her side, tearing at the enemy, but even they were beginning to slow, their magical forms flickering. Percy's arrival was not a heroic charge. It was a tide turning. He didn't yell a war cry. He simply let his presence be known. He reached out and drew upon the ambient moisture in the high-altitude air, thin and spare as it was. It wasn't enough to make a wave, but it was enough to make a fog. A cold, supernaturally dense mist rolled across the battlefield, clinging to the ground, swallowing the sickly golden light of the ritual and plunging the battle into a confusing, gray twilight. The sun scorched. Who fought with the certainty of the light at their backs, hesitated. Their coordination faltered. The Romans, accustomed to fighting in the chaos of battle, pressed their advantage. Then Percy moved. He was not a warrior fighting alongside them. He was a force of pure, targeted destruction. He became a phantom in his own mist. A squad of zealots, advancing on a weakened section of the Roman line, suddenly found their feet frozen to the ground in black ice. Before they could react, Percy flowed out of the mist behind them, a whisper of movement. He didn't use a weapon. He used his hands. He moved down their line, a touch to the back of each zealot's neck. One by one, they dropped, their life force consumed in a silent, invisible rush, their bodies turning to withered husks before they hit the ground. He was a plague, a whisper of death moving through the enemy ranks. He never engaged in a prolonged fight. He struck from the shadows of his own making, bled the enemy dry, and vanished before they could mount a counterattack. The tide of the battle, which had been a relentless golden wave crashing against a crumbling Roman wall, began to slow. Rhena saw him, a fleeting, dark shape in the mist, and her eyes widened in a mixture of horror and grim relief. This was the monster she had feared, and he was turning the tide of her battle. She didn't question it. She adapted. Reform the line, she bellowed, her voice cutting through the din. Use the mist. Centurions, coordinate your cohorts. Advance by sections. The legion, with a new, desperate hope, began to push back. Percy fought his way towards the center of the chaos, towards the golden, pulsating light of the ritual. The dryad at its heart was barely recognizable, her form now a twisted, glowing effigy of scorched wood and solidified light. Guarding her was the architect of this battle, one of Lycurgus's champions. He was tall and slender, where the forge master had been broad and powerful. He wore ornate, almost ceremonial golden armor, and he wielded no weapon. His hands glowed with a soft, gentle light. He stood with an air of serene, sorrowful calm, watching the battle, as if it were a sad but necessary tragedy. Percy emerged from the mist before him, the husks of the champion's personal guard collapsing behind him. The champion's golden eyes settled on Percy, and he gave a soft, gentle smile. "The heretic," he said, his voice calm and melodic. "You are as formidable as our Lord predicted. I am Lycomedes. I bear you no malice. I am merely a gardener, tending to the sacred soil. You're a torturer and a murderer," Percy snarled, the cold rage coiling in his gut. "Are you not the same?" Lycomedes countered, his smile never wavering. "You drain the life from my soldiers. You use fear and shadow as your tools. We both seek to impose our vision of order on the world. Mine is a vision of pure, harmonious light. Yours is a chaotic dance of shadow and blood. History will be the judge of which is the nobler path." He raised his hands, and the golden light around him intensified. Percy charged, but he didn't make it 2 steps before he slammed into an invisible wall of force. A barrier of pure, condensed sunlight. He struck it with his full, vampiric strength, and the barrier barely shimmered. Lycomedes was not a warrior. He was a priest, a channel for his god's power. And here, at the site of his consecrated well, that power was nearly absolute. Bolts of golden energy, the same that had shattered the Roman shields, shot from Lycomedes's hands. Percy was forced back, dodging and weaving, the light searing the ground where he had stood. He was on the defensive, unable to get close, unable to bring his greatest weapon, his life-draining touch, to bear. He saw the Romans faltering again. Their advance had stalled against the renewed fervor of the zealots, who were drawing strength from the well. He saw Frank, in the form of a giant python, get struck by a golden spear. The snake roared in agony, its form flickering, before collapsing back into a wounded, bleeding demigod. They were out of time. Brute force wasn't working. He had to think. This wasn't a fight to be won with power. It had to be won with heresy. He stopped his retreat. He stood his ground, letting the bolts of golden energy scream towards him. And then he did something that defied all logic, all instinct. He reached out not with his power over water or shadow, but with the very core of his vampiric nature, the ability to consume. He didn't try to block the golden bolts. He tried to eat them. The first bolt struck him, and the pain was absolute. It was like swallowing the sun. His entire being screamed in protest. The divine, purifying energy was antithetical to his dark nature. It was poison, but as the energy flooded him, he did not let it destroy him. He wrapped the cold, hungry void of his vampiric essence around it, not to extinguish it, but to contain it, to absorb it. To make it his own. Lycomed stared, his serene composure finally breaking. He saw Percy, wreathed in golden fire, his body trembling with the strain, but he was not burning. He was not being purified. He was holding the light within himself. Impossible, Lycomedes breathed. No creature of the dark can contain the sacred fire. I'm not just a creature of the dark, Percy gritted out. His voice a pained growl. His sea-green demigod essence rose up, not to fight the golden energy, but to merge with it, the salt of the sea meeting the fire of the sun. He was a hybrid. He was the ultimate heresy. And in that moment, he turned his nature from a curse into a weapon. He felt the power settle within him, a terrifying, unstable union of light and dark, sea and sun, life and undeath. He opened his eyes, and they were no longer just sea green flecked with crimson. They were now pools of molten gold, swirling with the dark red of his vampiric blood. He had consumed his enemy's power. He took a step forward, and the ground cracked under his feet. He raised a hand, and from his palm erupted not a jet of water or a tendril of shadow, but a beam of raw, corrupted, golden black energy. It was the sacred fire of Lycurgus, twisted and tainted by the void of the vampire. The beam struck Lycomedes' barrier, and the shield of pure light shattered like glass. The Champion's face was a mask of horrified disbelief. He had devoted his life to the cause of purity, and he was now facing an enemy who had turned that purity into a profane weapon. Percy was on him in an instant. He didn't touch him. He didn't need to. He simply unleashed the unstable, stolen power that was now raging within him. The corrupted light poured out of him, a nova of golden black energy washed over the champion and the ritual site. Lycomedes didn't scream. He simply looked at the profane light that was unmaking him, a single tear of fire tracing a path down his cheek, and then he was gone. Erased by a twisted version of his own god's power. The ritual circle shattered. The tortured dryad at its center was released from her torment, her form dissolving into a shower of gentle, grateful leaves. The well of purity, its power source severed, collapsed in on itself with a sound like a dying star. The golden light that had empowered the zealots vanished, leaving them suddenly, terrifyingly mortal. The Romans, seeing their enemies falter, let out a unified, triumphant roar. They charged, no longer a desperate shield wall, but a vengeful sword. The battle turned into a rout. Percy stood in the center of the now dark plateau, the stolen power receding, leaving him shaking, drained, and feeling more violated than victorious. He had won. He had saved the Legion. But he had been forced to consume the very thing he was fighting against, to taint himself with his enemy's fire. Reyna walked up to him, her face grim, her sword dripping with golden monster dust. She looked at the devastation, at her wounded and dead legionnaires, and then at Percy. The price was high, she said, her voice heavy. But you paid it. You have saved the Legion, Jackson. Rome is in your debt. It was not a declaration of friendship. It was a statement of fact, a political reality forged in the heat of battle. The war for their pantheon had begun, and Percy, the heretic, the abomination, was now its unwilling, undisputed champion. He had won the battle not as a hero of Olympus, but as something new, something born of all the warring parts of their world, and his victory had just bound the fates of Rome and his own dark kingdom together forever. Chapter 9 End. Chapter 10. The Eclipse of a God. The aftermath of the battle was a landscape of grim, quiet efficiency. The well of purity had collapsed into a crater of inert, glassy rock, and the last of Lycurgus's zealots were being rounded up by the surviving Roman legionnaires. Victory was a taste of ash in Percy's mouth. He stood on the edge of the plateau, the cold Colorado wind whipping at his clothes, feeling the ghost of the corrupted light he had absorbed still screaming inside him. It was a foreign energy, a poison his very soul was trying to reject. Reyna, her armor dented and her face a mask of weary command, approached him, Frank at her side. Frank was leaning heavily on a spear, a deep gash in his side hastily bandaged, but his eyes were clear. They had held the line. They had paid the price. The reports are coming in from our scouts, Reyna said, her voice devoid of triumph. Talia's hunters have confirmed it. The attack on your mother was orchestrated by Hermes. He used his authority as the god of travelers to bypass the wards and guide the monsters to her location. The confirmation was a cold, hard stone settling in Percy's gut. Not a guess, a fact, and the last forge, the Gamma site, has gone dark, Frank added, his voice gravelly. It seems our victory here sent a shockwave through their network. They're pulling back, consolidating. They had won, truly won. They had cut the head off the snake's army. But the snake itself, the god who commanded it, was still coiled and waiting. As if summoned by the thought, a pressure descended on the plateau. It was not a physical presence, but a vast, intimate, psychic weight. It felt as if the sun itself had lowered from the sky to whisper directly into Percy's mind. Less than you have broken my soldiers, child of the tainted sea, greater than the voice of Lycurgus echoed, not with rage, but with a vast, cosmic disappointment. Less than you have shattered my forge and undone my well. You use your impurity as a weapon. You have proven yourself to be not just a symptom of the disease, but its most virulent strain. Greater than. Percy braced himself, feeling the mental intrusion. This was not a projection. It was a direct connection, a god's will pressing into his own. Less than the time for proxies is over. The time for crusades is at an end. I will perform the great purification myself. I will go to the very heart of your chaotic world, to the place that has spawned more of your kind than any other. I will cleanse the festering wound you call Camp Half-Blood. Greater than. This. Ion flooded Percy's mind. The peaceful valley of Camp Half-Blood, the strawberry fields, the big house, all consumed in a wave of purifying, golden fire. Less than I offer one final mercy, heretic, greater than the voice concluded. Less than surrender the camp. Evacuate your brethren and allow me to cauterize the source of this infection. Do this, and I will consider my work complete. Defy me, and I will erase every last race of your hybrid world from this earth. I will come with the next eclipse, when the sun is momentarily cloaked in shadow, a fitting symbol for your end. You have 2 days. Greater than. The pressure vanished. Percy was left standing on the windy plateau, the ultimatum echoing in the sudden silence. The war was not over. The final battle had just been declared. The news ripped through the fragile coalition like a shockwave. Camp Half-Blood, the nexus of the Greek world, was now the final battlefield. For the Romans, it was a place of ancestral rivalry. For the hunters, a den of boys they had sworn to avoid. Now, it was the place they all had to defend, or there would be nothing left for anyone. They converged on the Long Island Valley in a tense, historic migration. The 12th Legion Fulminatum marched through the magical borders. Their golden eagle standard held high, a sight that would have caused a war just a few months ago. The hunters of Artemis melted into the woods, their silver banners. A stark contrast to the camp's orange and purple, setting up silent, deadly perimeter traps. The camp itself was a frantic hive of activity. Satyrs guided terrified nature spirits to the safety of the deepest parts of the forest. Demigods, some with faces Percy had known since he was 12, worked to fortify the cabins and arm the walls. In the center of it all was the War Council, held in the chaotic mess of the big house rec room. Annabeth stood over a map of the valley, her mind a whirlwind of defensive architecture, designating kill zones and fallback positions. Reyna and Frank organize the combined forces into cohesive units, blending Roman discipline with Greek unpredictability. Talia, as the de facto leader of the hunters, coordinated the reconnaissance and asymmetric warfare. But when they looked for the final word, they all looked to Percy. He had become the center of their new, desperate world. He spent most of the 2 days in the Long Island Sound, submerged in the cold, dark water. Battling a war within himself. The golden energy he had absorbed from Lycomedes was a constant, burning agony. It was a poison of purity, trying to sear away the vampiric darkness that was now a part of him. He had to tame it, to force a balance between the warring aspects of his soul. He had to turn the poison into a weapon. On the eve of the final battle, Annabeth found him on the beach, staring out at the dark water. The rage and coldness had receded, leaving behind a deep, profound weariness. "You're afraid," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I have the power of a god inside me, Annabeth," he said, his voice quiet. "And it feels like it's burning me alive. What if I can't control it? What if, in the fight, I become him?" She sat next to him on the sand, her presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm of his doubts. "You won't," she said, her voice full of a certainty that defied the coming apocalypse. "He wields his power with the certainty that he is pure. You wield yours with the knowledge that you are not. That doubt, Percy, that humanity, that's what makes you stronger. You're not becoming him. You're building a weapon from him. You are the flaw in his perfect, orderly world. Be the flaw. Be the chaos he can't comprehend. Control it." He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence and unwavering loyalty in her gray eyes, and felt a moment of perfect, terrifying clarity. He reached out and took her hand. It wasn't a gesture of romance. It was the pact of a warrior and a strategist, a silent acknowledgement that whatever came tomorrow, they would face it together. Later that night, a figure shimmered into existence at the edge of the woods. It was Hermes, his face stripped of its usual cavalier smirk, leaving behind the ancient, weary eyes of a god who had seen too much. "An impressive gathering," Hermes said, gesturing to the armed camp. "All for a fire I started." Percy met him alone. There was no anger left, only a cold need for answers. "Why?" "Because we were dying," Hermes said, his voice surprisingly raw. "Not in a grand, epic war, but of stagnation. Of pride. Zeus saw threats in every shadow, Poseidon slumbered in his seas. And the rest of us were content to play our little games. We were forgetting what it meant to be gods, because we had nothing to fear. I didn't know Lycurgus would be a purifier. I just knew the world needed a challenge, a predator to remind the herd why they have teeth." He looked at Percy, his gaze intense. "I gambled that a new hero would rise from the chaos. I was right. You sacrificed Lee Fletcher on that gamble," Percy said, his voice flat. "Yes," Hermes admitted, his face clouding with a flicker of genuine regret. "And countless others. The price of change is always paid in blood. But that is the way of our world." He took a step closer. "I came to give you a weapon, Perseus. One you will need. Lycurgus is more than a god. He is an idea. He is few, led by his own absolute belief in divine purity. To fight his power is to prove his point. You cannot kill his body until you kill his philosophy." With that cryptic piece of advice, the messenger god dissolved into the wind, leaving Percy alone with the final, philosophical key to victory. The next day, the eclipse began. A creeping darkness fell over the world, the sun becoming a black disk haloed by a ring of ethereal fire. The temperature dropped. An unnatural twilight descended on Camp Half-Blood. The combined army of Greeks, Romans, and hunters stood ready, a silent, grim force waiting for the end of the world. It came not as an army, but as a whisper. A single beam of shadowy, eclipsed sunlight touched down on Half-Blood Hill. It was a pillar of darkness that burned, a perfect knife station of Lycurgus's paradoxical nature. From this dark light, the god stepped forth. He was physically present now, radiating an aura of such absolute, crushing order that the chaotic life of the forest seemed to wither around him. He was alone. He needed no one else. With a simple, elegant gesture, he raised a shimmering dome of golden energy over the hill, trapping Percy and himself inside, the rest of the army sealed out, forced to watch the duel that would decide their fate. "Heretic," Lycurgus said, his voice the calm of a surgeon before an incision. "Let us end this." He attacked not with fire or force, but with concepts. A spear of pure, metaphysical order materialized in his hand, a weapon designed not to pierce flesh, but to correct Percy's soul, to violently separate his divine, mortal, and vampiric natures. Percy dodged, the spear striking the ground and leaving a patch of perfectly sterile, lifeless earth. Percy fought back with a storm of his own creation. He summoned a tsunami from the sound. But Lycurgus simply raised a hand and the water became perfectly still, its chaotic nature quelled. He attacked with shadows, but Lycurgus incinerated them with a glance. Percy was a force of nature. But Lycurgus was a force of absolute cosmic law. He was being systematically dismantled. He was losing. Then he remembered Hermes's words. Kill his philosophy. He stopped his retreat. He stopped trying to win a fight of power against power. He began to defy. Lycurgus hurled a wave of purifying fire. Instead of dodging, Percy met it. He plunged his hands into the torrent, not trying to stop it, but to embrace it. He let his vampiric and divine natures merge, creating a maelstrom of shadow-infused seawater that met the fire. The two forces didn't cancel each other out. They clashed in a screaming, chaotic explosion of steam and shadow, anathema to Lycurgus's orderly world. He was no longer just fighting. He was making a statement. He was the living embodiment of the chaos Lycurgus so despised. He teleported through the mist, leaving behind solid ice clones. He used his blood, hardened into crimson blades, to parry attacks of pure light. He was a walking, fighting paradox. A refutation of the god's entire existence. And then, for the final, ultimate act of heresy, he unleashed the power he had stolen from Lycomedes. He didn't fire it, he wore it. A profane, sickening aura of golden black light erupted around him. He stood before the god of purity, cloaked in a corrupted, twisted version of his own sacred fire. For the first time, a crack appeared in Lycurgus's serene, divine composure. He stared at the corrupted light, his own power turned into a weapon of impurity, and his perfect, absolute belief wavered for a single, fatal instant. That was all Percy needed. He lunged forward, moving through the god's faltering defenses. He wasn't aiming to strike a mortal blow. He was aiming to make contact. He slammed his hand onto the center of Lycurgus's chest. And he began to pull. It was not a violent, ripping drain of energy. It was a subtle, terrifying consumption of essence. He was drinking the god's philosophy, his divine right, his very concept. Lycurgus screamed. It was a sound of pure, existential horror. The heretic, the abomination, the impurity was not just defeating him, he was consuming him, proving that the dark could swallow the light. That chaos could conquer order. His belief, the very source of his power, shattered. And as his ideology crumbled, his power crumbled with it. Percy did not stop until the torrent of divine energy slowed to a trickle. He didn't kill the god. He did something far worse. He left him a hollowed-out shell, an immortal with the barest spark of divinity, his connection to his conceptual authority severed forever. The golden dome around the hill collapsed. The eclipse ended. The full light of the sun returned, warm and life-giving, no longer a tool of a tyrant. Percy stood, shaking and exhausted, over the broken, defeated form of Lycurgus. The combined army of demigods and hunters stared in silent, terrified awe. He had not just won a war. He had unmade a god. He looked out at them, at the faces of Greeks, Romans, and hunters, now looking to him not with friendship or rivalry, but with a profound, world-altering respect. He was no longer a hero of Olympus, a pawn in a divine game. He was a power in his own right, a king forged in shadow and victory. He hadn't just saved their world. He had inherited the terrifying, exhilarating burden of leading it into the new, uncertain age he had just created. Chapter 10 End.